I had been planning this camping trip for weeks, long enough to imagine the crackling campfire and the smell of fresh pine in the cool night air. The idea was simple: a few days out in the woods, no distractions, just me and the great outdoors. No one else around, just peace and quiet. I'd had enough of city life, the noise, the constant rush. This was supposed to be my escape, a time to clear my head and reset. The plan was to head out to a secluded spot near the edge of the wilderness. I'd chosen a quiet national park in northern Canada, somewhere far off the beaten path, in a place called Wildwood Park. I'd seen it on a map, nestled between towering pines, with a lake nearby and only a few trails leading to the site. Perfect. I'd packed light, a small tent, my trusty old sleeping bag, a few cans of beans, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I even brought a pocket knife just in case, though I wasn't sure for what. I wanted to keep it minimal. No cell phone, no internet, no distractions. The whole idea was to immerse myself fully in nature. I arrived at the park early in the afternoon, after a long drive. The roads were narrow and winding, the kind you see in movies where the trees grow so close together it feels like you're driving through a green tunnel. There were few signs of life out here, just the occasional bird flying overhead or a squirrel darting through the underbrush. Everything felt so still, so untouched. I parked the car in a small clearing, right next to a trail that led deep into the forest. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I could feel a slight chill in the air, even though it was early fall. It wasn't quite cold yet, but you could tell the nights here would be chilly. I grabbed my gear, set up the tent, and got everything settled in. By the time I had everything set up, the sky was turning orange and pink with the setting sun. The campfire would be my next priority. I gathered some dry wood and started a fire, the crackle of the flames filling the otherwise silent air. As the fire flickered, I settled into my camp chair, enjoying the warmth. The fire was a small one, just enough to keep the cold at bay. The smoke twisted upward, disappearing into the darkening sky. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I felt the weight of the quiet press in on me, the stillness of the woods surrounding me, like something was lurking just beyond the trees, watching. But I shook off the thought. I was alone, and that's how I wanted it. Nightfall came quickly. I finished my beans and sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood and the occasional rustling of leaves. I packed a book but hadn't even opened it. I was too absorbed in the sounds of the forest, the way the wind whispered through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the soft patter of something moving in the underbrush. Then, just after midnight, I heard it. A noise. It was faint at first, like something brushing against a tree, but then it came again, clearer this time. A series of slow, deliberate footsteps. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a bear. I knew there were bears in the area, though they weren't common this time of year. But the sound didn't quite match that of an animal. It was too purposeful, too steady. I sat up straighter in my chair, straining my ears to hear. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, waiting. Then they started again, moving closer this time. I couldn't see anything, but the noise was undeniable. Whoever or whatever it was moving towards my camp. I wasn't sure what to do. The woods were pitch black beyond the reach of my firelight. My flashlight was just an arm's length away, but I hesitated. I didn't want to reveal my position. Whoever was out there might not be friendly, and I wasn't about to give them an easy target. I grabbed the knife from my bag and held it tightly in my hand, feeling the cold steel against my palm. I told myself it was probably nothing. A lost hiker, maybe, or just an animal that had wandered too close. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The footsteps came closer. I could hear them crunching through the leaves, slow and deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my heart rate quickening. I was being watched. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. Complete silence filled the air. It felt oppressive, suffocating, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing came. No more footsteps, no movement. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on, swinging the beam of light across the dark woods. It cut through the night like a sword, illuminating the trees, the ground, everything within reach. There was nothing there, just the trees, the underbrush, and the endless shadows. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I was being paranoid. There was no one out there. It was probably just an animal that had wandered too close, or maybe even the wind. I had spent enough time in the woods to know that things could sound a lot scarier than they really were. But as I settled back down into my chair, the thought didn't leave me. That feeling of being watched, of something out there in the dark, was still with me. I kept the flashlight close by, scanning the trees every few seconds, but the night remained still, almost too still. The next few hours passed uneventfully, but I couldn't sleep. I kept my eye on the fire, feeding it a few more logs to keep it going through the night. The crackling of the flames was my only comfort, a steady reminder that at least something was still alive out here. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I decided it was time to pack up and head back. Something about the night had shaken me, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. The calm, peaceful trip I had imagined wasn't so peaceful anymore. I quickly packed my things, carefully dismantling the tent and gathering up all my gear. When everything was packed, I threw the bags into the back of the car and started the engine. As I drove out of the woods, I glanced back in the rearview mirror. The forest was still and quiet, just like when I first arrived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I never found out who or what had been in the woods with me that night, but I've never returned to Wildwood Park. Some places, I think, are better left unexplored. It's been years since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I think back on it. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I can still hear those footsteps, and I wonder if, just maybe, something is still out there. It was a late summer evening when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains. I needed time to clear my head, to disconnect from the usual noise of everyday life. I had done plenty of hiking in these mountains before, but never alone, never this far in, and definitely never at night. I was 28 at the time, feeling adventurous and craving solitude. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a slight breeze, and just the right temperature. I packed my gear, made sure to bring enough food and water, and set off for a small campsite I had found during a previous hike. The trail was quiet, the kind of peace you can only find deep in the woods. My steps were rhythmic, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots almost soothing. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker, blocking out the sunlight and casting long shadows across the path. I wasn't worried, though. I had hiked in these woods enough to know what to expect. I reached my destination just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. It was a small, secluded clearing by a stream, far enough from any major trails that I would be alone. The ground was soft but not muddy, the perfect spot for setting up my tent. I gathered some firewood and got to work on a fire, knowing it would be the only source of light and warmth once night fully fell. As the sun disappeared and the sky darkened, I finished setting up camp. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks up into the air, and I sat back on a log to enjoy the solitude. The only sounds now were the gentle flow of the stream and the occasional crack of a branch. I ate my meal, a simple freeze-dried dinner, and watched the flames dance. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, the night had fully settled in. I was tired, the hike had worn me out, and the peaceful surroundings made it easy to slip into a relaxed state. I was just about to crawl into my tent when I heard it. A noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. At first, I thought it was just the wind or some animal, but then it happened again, closer this time. It was the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, not the hurried steps of an animal, but the heavy, almost human-like weight of someone walking through the woods. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and my eyes darted around the clearing, searching the shadows. Nothing. The woods around me were silent, save for the usual nighttime sounds. But the feeling of being watched settled over me, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was alone, and the woods often played tricks on your mind, especially at night. But the footsteps continued, slowly circling my camp. I couldn't see anything through the trees, but I could feel the presence, as if someone, or something, was just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and shone it into the trees, but all I saw were shadows. My hand was shaking as I lowered the beam and checked the fire. The flames were still there, but the warmth that had once been comforting now felt like an illusion. I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse than the noise had been. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Should I call for help? But I was miles from the nearest town with no cell service. No one would hear me out here. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in, suffocating the light of the fire. I felt the unmistakable sensation that someone was standing just behind me, watching. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I focused on my breathing, trying to steady myself. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps began again. This time, they were moving toward the camp, slow but deliberate. I couldn't tell if they were circling me or if they were coming straight for me. I gripped the flashlight tightly, ready to defend myself, though I had no idea what I would do if I encountered whatever, or whoever, was out there. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. "Are you alone out here?" I didn't answer, couldn't answer. My mind was racing, heart pounding in my chest. I turned the beam of the flashlight toward the voice, but all I saw was the edge of the forest, dark and impenetrable. The voice came again, this time from a different direction. "You shouldn't be out here alone." A chill ran down my spine. I had heard nothing else. No rustling in the leaves, no footsteps, nothing that would indicate someone was nearby. I had been so careful to check my surroundings, so certain no one was here. But now it felt like I wasn't alone at all. I quickly unzipped the tent and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind me. My breathing was erratic as I tried to process what had just happened. Who was out there? And why didn't they just come into the camp? What were they waiting for? For hours, I lay there wide awake, listening for any sounds, any indication that someone was still out there. The fire had long since died down, leaving the forest even darker and quieter. But nothing happened. No more footsteps, no more voices. The silence seemed almost unnatural. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I was exhausted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong, that something had been watching me. But nothing had happened. No one had shown themselves. The world outside was still, calm, and untouched. The usual morning sounds of birds chirping and the rustle of wind through the trees filled the air. I packed up my camp in a daze, my thoughts still swirling. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying another night in these woods. As I hiked back down the trail, the feeling of being watched never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something just out of sight, but there was nothing. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. No one would have believed me, not without proof. And I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But the one thing I couldn't shake was the certainty that something had been out there with me, something that never revealed itself, something that I could never fully understand. As I reached the end of the trail and saw the parking lot in the distance, I finally let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. The sun was fully up now, the day bright and clear. It was over. Whatever had happened, it was in the past. But I knew I wouldn't be back. Not to that spot, not to those woods. Whatever had watched me in the dark had won. It had left me with nothing but questions. And some things I knew were better left unanswered. It was the summer of 2022 when I decided to take a break from the city and head into the wilderness. I'd been feeling the weight of my job and the constant noise of urban life. It wasn't much of a plan at first, just a vague idea to get away, clear my head, and spend a few days in the quiet of nature. I hadn't gone camping in years, but I thought it'd be nice to return to that feeling of being alone in the woods. I packed up my gear, A simple tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, and a backpack with a few essentials. I didn't bother with too much food because I wanted to catch my own meals. Fishing sounded like a peaceful way to spend the day. I drove out to a national park in the Adirondacks. The drive was long, almost 4 hours, but it gave me plenty of time to think and let the tension from my shoulders ease. The place I chose was fairly secluded, the kind of spot that wasn't on the main hiking trails but was close enough to a river to make fishing easy. I knew it would be quiet, but what I didn't expect was just how empty it would feel. The air felt different up there, crisp and heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I drove deeper into the forest, the road began to thin, and the sounds of civilization, cars, people, even the hum of streetlights, disappeared completely. I reached my campsite just as the sun started to dip below the treeline, casting a soft orange glow across the landscape. It was the kind of setting that looked like it belonged in a painting. No one around, just the wind in the trees, the murmur of the river, and the occasional call of a bird. Setting up camp was simple enough. I pitched my tent near a small clearing by the riverbank and set up a fire pit. The air was growing cooler as night approached, and I was glad I brought an extra layer of clothing. I lit the campfire and sat by it, listening to the crackling wood. The only other sounds were the distant rush of the river and the occasional rustling in the trees. It wasn't long before I got the feeling that something was off. At first, I couldn't place it, but the silence seemed deeper than it should have been. No animals, no insects buzzing around, not even the usual chirping of crickets. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I shook it off, probably just my imagination, and focused on cooking my dinner, a simple meal of beans and rice. The night grew darker, and I felt more and more alone. I was fine with solitude, but the eerie stillness around me started to gnaw at the edges of my mind. When I finished eating, I sat by the fire for a while, trying to enjoy the warmth, but the silence was deafening. I had never been out in the woods without hearing at least some signs of life. Animals scurrying around, wind rustling the leaves. But tonight, nothing. It was like the forest had been emptied. Eventually, I decided to crawl into my tent and call it a night. I secured everything and zipped the door shut, feeling a little safer in the small, confined space. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear a rustling sound outside, faint but distinct. My heart would race, and I'd sit up in my sleeping bag, straining to listen. But every time I checked, nothing was there. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if there was something out there. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise that was definitely not my imagination. It was a low, scraping sound, like something heavy was moving through the forest floor. I froze, holding my breath. The sound was close, too close. It wasn't the typical noises you hear from animals, like deer or raccoons. It sounded deliberate. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound stopped. Then, just as suddenly, I heard something heavier crash through the underbrush, like a large branch being broken. My mind was racing now, trying to figure out what it could be. Bears? Person? I couldn't take the risk. I grabbed my flashlight, but as I moved to open the tent, I heard another noise. A deep, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. That wasn't an animal I was familiar with. I lay still, trying to control my breathing, afraid that any movement would make whatever it was come closer. The growling continued, rhythmic and steady, as if it were circling my camp. I couldn't hear any footsteps, just that low growl and the occasional rustle of leaves. My mind raced through every possibility. I thought about hiking out of the area, but it was pitch dark, and I had no idea where I might end up if I left in the middle of the night. The growling stopped, but I didn't dare open the tent. I could hear the wind picking up outside, and with it, a few stray noises that sounded like whispers. That's when I realized the silence earlier wasn't just the usual peaceful quiet of the woods. It was unnatural. Something was wrong here, and I didn't know what it was. I must have drifted off eventually because when I woke up, the sky was just beginning to lighten. The air was still, the sun's first rays piercing through the canopy above. I cautiously unzipped the tent and peeked outside, half expecting to see something waiting for me. But there was nothing, just the same old forest. I stepped outside, my senses on high alert. My campfire had long since gone out, and my gear was where I'd left it. There were no signs of any disturbance around the campsite. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. The only odd thing was that the feeling of being watched hadn't left. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I decided to pack up. There was no way I was going to stay another night in this strange, oppressive silence. I gathered everything, keeping my eyes peeled for anything unusual, and as I was about to leave, I saw something in the distance, a shadow moving among the trees. It was brief, just a flicker at the edge of my vision, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I didn't wait around to see if it would appear again. I packed up faster, adrenaline kicking in, and as soon as I was done, I grabbed my backpack and started walking back toward my car. The trail back was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every now and then, I'd hear a snap of a twig, a rustling in the underbrush, but when I turned around, there was nothing. By the time I reached my car, the sun had fully risen, and the woods seemed less oppressive, more normal. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back here. The strange quiet, the growling in the night, the sense of being watched. It all added up to something I didn't want to understand. As I drove out of the park, I couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking behind me. But there was nothing, just the forest stretching out behind. I didn't know what had happened, but I was sure of one thing. Some places in the wilderness are best left alone. And for the first time in my life, I understood the true meaning of silence. I had always loved the outdoors, the peace of the forest, the crisp air of the mountains, and the sound of a quiet stream flowing nearby. But on this particular trip, I found myself questioning why I ever decided to venture out there alone. I was 27, far away from the hustle of the city, and looking for some peace of mind after a grueling few months of work and stress. It was early autumn, and the air had just the right chill to it, perfect for camping. I drove up to a small campsite by the base of a mountain range, the kind of place that wasn't too popular, which suited me just fine. I had a tent, a couple of sleeping bags, some food, and a small fire pit. I wanted simplicity, something that would force me to disconnect from everything. The woods were quiet, the kind of silence that makes you realize how rare it is in the everyday noise of life. As I set up camp, I felt the weight of the day melt away, and for a while, everything felt right. The first few hours were perfect. I sat by the fire, roasted some marshmallows, and watched the stars appear as the night deepened. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, the kind of peaceful silence that I sought. But as the evening wore on, something felt off. At first, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks. The sound of the wind through the trees, maybe an animal rustling in the underbrush. But there was something else, a feeling that I couldn't shake. It wasn't the typical something's watching me kind of feeling. No, it was different. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to ignore it. I had seen the occasional flicker of movement in the corner of my eyes. But again, I told myself it was just the wind or a raccoon, maybe even a deer. But still, that unease lingered. I didn't sleep much that night. The wind picked up, but it was more than just the usual gusts. There was a strange rhythm to it, almost like it was trying to say something. The trees swayed, their creaks echoing in the night air. I kept telling myself that it was just nature, but deep down, a nagging voice reminded me how far away I was from any other campers or people. And then there was the fire. It was burning brightly one moment, only to flicker down low the next, as if someone were playing with it. Around midnight, I decided I had enough. I would take a short walk to clear my mind. Nothing serious, just around the campsite. But when I stepped away from the fire, the sudden silence was so overwhelming it almost made my skin crawl. The sounds of the wind, the rustling leaves, and distant animal calls had stopped altogether. All that remained was the faint sound of my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. The walk didn't bring the peace I had hoped for. Instead, I felt the cold, heavier now, seeping into my bones. The shadows in the forest seemed to stretch out, and my mind couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It wasn't just the normal fear that comes from being alone in the wilderness. It was something deeper, a primal instinct that screamed something was wrong. I quickened my pace and eventually returned to my camp, my heart pounding. That's when I saw it. A small bundle of twigs had been placed right in front of my tent. At first, I thought it was some sort of animal nest, but the arrangement was too deliberate. The twigs were arranged in a way that was almost symbolic, like a warning. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to make of it. I crouched down, my mind racing. This wasn't just some random animal behavior. It was too intentional. I took a few steps back, scanning the trees around me, but the only thing I could see were the shadows. I had never felt so alone. The world around me felt still, but underneath that stillness, there was something moving, something lurking in the darkness. For the rest of the night, I stayed awake, my eyes flicking from the fire to the trees, straining to catch any sound. The silence was maddening. I couldn't tell if the unease I felt was just in my head, or if something was genuinely off. Every time I looked around, I felt like I was being watched, but every time I turned my head, nothing was there. By morning, I had barely slept. The sun had risen over the mountains, and the orange glow of the early morning light seemed to ease the tension in my body. I thought that maybe, after a night of little sleep and too much isolation, my mind had just started playing tricks on me. I packed up my camp, intending to hike a few miles deeper into the woods to clear my head. Maybe I'd find a better spot. But as I was packing up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A footprint. A large, heavy boot print in the dirt near my tent. It was fresh, maybe from the night before, but I didn't hear anyone approach. I scanned the ground around me again. There were no other prints leading in or out. It was as though someone had stood there, just watching me, then left without a trace. I felt a chill run up my spine. It wasn't just the isolation now. It was the certainty that I wasn't alone out there. I didn't know who or what it was, but I had the distinct impression that someone had been circling my camp all night. But who and why? The thought of staying another night crossed my mind, but that was quickly overshadowed by the rising panic in my chest. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to leave. I grabbed my gear, threw everything into the car, and without a second thought, started my engine. As I pulled away from the site, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The campsite seemed so small now, so distant. It looked peaceful, normal even. But I knew better. Something had happened there, something I couldn't explain, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out. That day, I drove straight back to the nearest town. I didn't look back until I reached the safety of a small inn on the edge of the woods. I thought about calling the ranger station, but I wasn't sure what I would even say. Hey, I think someone was out there watching me? The whole situation felt insane, but the fear was real. The next morning, I woke up early, needing a clear head. I didn't even realize how exhausted I was until I tried to eat breakfast. But as I sipped my coffee, I overheard a conversation between two hikers at a nearby table. They were talking about the same area where I had camped, about people who had gone missing in the past, hikers who'd vanished without a trace, and strange things happening in the woods. I tried not to eavesdrop, but it was hard to ignore. Apparently, this wasn't the first time someone had felt the presence of something in those woods. I didn't stick around to hear the rest of the story. I paid my bill, grabbed my things, and drove home, my mind still spinning with what had happened. As I reflect on it now, years later, I can't say for certain what happened that night. Was it just my imagination, the isolation, or was there something out there, something real and human, watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down? I've been back to the woods a few times since then, but I never camped alone again. And sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone, I wonder if I'll ever get a real answer. But I'll never forget that feeling, the feeling that someone was out there. Just watch. It was late September in the small town of Blanchard, tucked away in the woods of northern Michigan. I was 27 years old, an adventurer by heart, always seeking the next hike, the next camping trip, the next challenge. The fall air had just begun to cool, but there was still enough warmth left in the days to enjoy the outdoors. That weekend, I had decided to venture out on my own for a camping trip. I'd done it many times before, but something about this particular trip felt different. I had just left the main road and was driving down a narrow, winding dirt path that led deeper into the forest. The trees stretched tall and thick around me, their branches heavy with the weight of leaves turning shades of red and gold. I could hear the crunch of the gravel under my tires, the only sound breaking the silence. No one had been out here in days, maybe weeks. The thought should have been calming, but there was something unsettling about it. The isolation felt thicker than usual, like the forest itself was closing in around me. My destination was a remote campground I had heard about from a couple of hikers I'd met a few months back. It wasn't on any official map, which made it even more appealing. The idea of being completely alone in the middle of nowhere had a strange allure to it. It was supposed to be peaceful, a place where you could truly disconnect. I hadn't seen anyone else since I left the last town, and I was starting to wonder if anyone even came here anymore. When I finally reached the campsite, I was relieved to find it exactly as I expected. Untouched, abandoned, and perfect. There were no other campers around, no noise, just the peaceful hum of the wind rustling through the trees. I parked my truck at the edge of a small clearing, close enough to the fire pit but far enough from the other camping spots to have my privacy. The ground was soft with moss, and the air smelled of earth and pine. The perfect spot. Setting up my tent was a simple task, and within an hour, everything was ready. I had a small campfire going, and after unpacking some food, I settled down for the evening. The fire crackled, and the flames danced brightly in the gathering dusk. It was the kind of night where you could feel the chill creeping in once the sun went down, but as long as I was by the fire, I was comfortable. The sun had long since disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, starless black. The only light came from the fire, casting flickering shadows across the ground. I leaned back against a log, roasting some marshmallows, when I noticed a slight rustling in the trees behind me. It wasn't the usual sounds of wildlife. This rustling had a deliberate rhythm to it, pattern. I dismissed it at first, telling myself it was just a raccoon or some other small animal, but the noise persisted, growing slightly louder. My heart began to race. I stood up and scanned the darkness, but all I saw were the silhouettes of trees, nothing moving. It was hard to shake the feeling that something was watching me. After a moment, I tried to brush it off. I wasn't a person who was easily scared. I had camped out in places much more isolated than this, and nothing had ever gone wrong. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if the air around me had suddenly thickened. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and made my way toward the edge of the clearing where the noise had come from. As I moved closer to the tree-line, the noise stopped. Everything went completely still. I called out to the trees, half expecting a response, but there was only silence. The flashlight beam illuminated the thick underbrush, but there was nothing there. No animal, no movement, just the faint rustling of leaves as a gentle breeze swept through the trees. I laughed nervously to myself. I was probably just jumpy. I had been out here alone for a while now, and the isolation was starting to get to me. I turned back toward the camp, only to hear a sharp crack behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. There, standing just outside the light's reach, was a figure. It was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, and its shape seemed wrong, like it was slightly too elongated for a person. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just standing there, watching me. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. I took a cautious step forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and the figure shifted, slowly moving further into the darkness, just out of the light's reach. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, or if it had been some trick of the shadows, but something deep in my gut told me it wasn't. I grabbed my phone and checked for a signal. Nothing. Of course. No reception out here. There was no one to help. The minutes that followed felt like hours. I debated packing up and leaving, but the thought of driving down that narrow dirt road in the dark, alone with that thing out there, was more terrifying than staying put. I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light or a deer standing in the shadows, but the doubt gnawed at me. Eventually, I managed to get some sleep, but it was restless. Every creak of the trees, every crack of a twig outside my tent kept me awake, my heart pounding in my chest. When morning came, I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, throwing everything into my truck, eager to get out of there. The day was clear and bright, but the woods around me felt different, as though they were holding their breath, waiting for something. I started the engine, the sound of the truck's engine breaking the silence of the forest. As I turned onto the dirt path and began heading back toward the main road, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The forest seemed empty, peaceful even, but I knew better than to trust that calm facade. I had been out there long enough to know that the woods didn't always play by the rules. They had their own secrets, their own rhythm, and I had just been a visitor passing through. It was only when I was miles away from the campsite, the trees thinning out behind me, that the tension in my chest began to ease. The knot in my stomach slowly unraveled. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was almost noon. A whole morning had passed since I left, and I hadn't seen anything else, heard any other strange noises. But even as the woods faded into the distance, the image of that figure lingered in my mind. It wasn't a person. I couldn't explain it, but something about it felt wrong. I drove home that day, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual, my thoughts racing. The isolation, the strange feeling that I wasn't alone, the figure. There was something out there, and I wasn't sure if it was human. Or if it had been, it wasn't anymore. By the time I reached my apartment, I was physically drained. But mentally, I felt alert, as though something was still out there, watching, waiting. The whole experience had shaken me. The woods were beautiful, sure, but they were also mysterious, and sometimes, even the most peaceful places held things that were better left undisturbed. I hadn't realized it then, but that camping trip had changed something inside me. I would never look at the forest the same way again. I had always loved the outdoors, the kind of love that stems from childhood camping trips with my family. But this time, it was different. This was a solo trip I'd been planning for months. I was 33 years old, living in a small town just outside of Burlington, Vermont. My work had been stressful lately, and I felt I needed time alone, away from everything. So, I decided to hike and camp in the woods near Mount Mansfield, a place I'd read about in hiking forums. The idea was to disconnect from the world, clear my head, and maybe even confront some of my own fears. I had checked my gear twice, packed carefully, and even arranged for a couple of friends to check in on me after a few days just to be safe. I knew the terrain, the weather forecast was good, and the area was supposed to be remote but not too wild. I figured it would be a good challenge without putting myself in serious danger. The first day of the hike was beautiful. The weather was crisp, but the sun was out, and the forest smelled like pine and fresh earth. The path was narrow but well-marked, and I felt the kind of peace that only comes from being far from civilization. I hiked for several hours, stopping occasionally to admire the view or grab a snack. My backpack wasn't heavy, and I felt strong. By the time I reached my planned camping spot, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I set up my tent in a small clearing beside a bubbling creek. The sound of the water was soothing. After getting everything arranged, I started a small fire. The warmth from the flames felt good against the cool evening air. I had brought a few books, some journals, and snacks to last me the night. As the night settled in, I ate, read a little, and then sat back, staring into the fire. It wasn't until the light dimmed and the forest around me grew quieter that I started to feel a little uneasy. It wasn't anything specific, but the silence felt heavier than I expected. The usual night sounds, the chirping of crickets and the calls of owls, seemed distant, muted. I brushed it off as nothing, but my mind began to wander. I kept hearing small noises, something scraping against the trees, twigs snapping in the underbrush, but every time I looked, nothing was there. I convinced myself that it was probably just animals going about their business, maybe deer or raccoons. Still, it nagged at me. I decided to head to my tent a little earlier than planned. The inside of the tent felt warmer, and I was grateful for the shelter. I zipped up the door, got comfortable, and tried to sleep, but the sounds continued. I was used to noises in the woods, but tonight was different. The sounds were closer, almost deliberate, like something was watching me. The rustling came from all directions, too consistent to be random. I told myself that I was just overthinking things. After all, this was a well-traveled area, and I wasn't far from a hiking trail. Still, every noise made my heart beat faster. I tried to ignore it and fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of wet earth. It had rained lightly through the night, but it was still early, and the fog had rolled in, making the forest look eerie and unfamiliar. I knew I had to move on, though, so I packed up my tent and gear, ready to continue my hike. My plan was to head deeper into the forest, to a lake I had read about on the hiking map. I spent the day navigating through thick woods, following the trail markers. I wasn't worried about getting lost. I had a compass, GPS, and plenty of experience. But by midday, something started to feel off. The trail markers seemed to get farther apart, and the path was harder to follow. I started to think that maybe I had missed a turn or two, but there was no point in turning back now. To come too far. By the time I reached the lake, it was late afternoon again. The fog had lifted a bit, but it still hung thick around the edges of the water, giving the lake an otherworldly feel. I set up camp by the shoreline, this time taking extra care to make sure everything was secure. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, I felt that same unsettling quiet creeping back into the air. The sounds of the forest had disappeared again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to take a walk along the edge of the lake to clear my head. The stillness of the water, reflecting the trees and sky like a perfect mirror, was beautiful, but it also felt strange. As I walked, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints, clear and fresh, leading along the water's edge. They weren't human, but they weren't animal either. They were almost too perfect, too precise. It made my stomach turn. Whoever or whatever had made those tracks, I didn't want to be near them. I turned back toward camp quickly, heart racing. The sun had set completely now, and the woods were cloaked in darkness. I started a fire again, trying to calm my nerves, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The rustling, the snapping twigs, this time it was undeniable. Something was out there. I kept the fire blazing, hoping it would keep whatever was in the woods away. But as the hours passed, the sounds grew closer. I'd occasionally glance over my shoulder, but no matter how hard I looked, I never saw anything. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up to strange sounds, the unmistakable feeling of eyes on me. And then, just before dawn, it happened. I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was walking through the woods toward me. My heart thudded in my chest. I didn't dare move. I barely even breathed. I lay perfectly still, praying that whatever it was would leave. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent, and for a long moment, there was complete silence. I didn't hear a thing. Then, a rustling sound, like something brushing against the tent, followed by a low growl. A shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my backpack, shoved everything I could into it, and rushed out of the tent, my mind screaming at me to run. But as soon as I stepped out into the clearing, I froze. There, in the dim light of early morning, I saw something I couldn't explain. A large, dark figure standing just on the edge of the forest, watching me. It wasn't human and it wasn't animal. Its outline was shadowy, but it was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, and its presence felt wrong in every way. My heart pounded in my ears, and I felt a surge of adrenaline like never before. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, just that I needed to get away. I ran through the trees, tripping over roots and rocks, not stopping until I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. The sounds faded, but I kept running, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail, a well-used path where other hikers passed through. I didn't know what I had encountered that night, and I didn't care to know. My mind raced with possibilities, but I didn't want to dwell on them. What mattered was that I was safe. I had made it back to civilization. I never finished the hike, never made it to the lake. I went straight to my car and drove home, my heart still pounding. That night, I slept like I hadn't in days, the comfort of my bed never feeling so welcome. The memory of what I saw, however, lingered. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I would ever forget. But I made it. I survived. And that was all that mattered. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when I finished setting up my tent. It was the first night of what I'd planned to be a week-long camping trip. I was 32, recently laid off from my office job, and needed a break from the everyday grind. I had been itching to get out into nature for a while, but finding time had been tough. Now that I had it, I planned to make the most of it. I was alone, no group, no friends, just me, the wilderness, and the kind of solitude I hadn't experienced in years. I was staying at a remote campsite near the Adirondacks. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I'd found online that seemed secluded enough for me to clear my mind. I hadn't planned on much. I just wanted to relax, maybe hike around a little, sit by the fire at night, and read a book. Nothing too fancy. It wasn't long before the chill of the evening set in, and I started a fire. The flames flickered against the gathering darkness, crackling and popping, sending sparks into the cool air. The scent of burning wood mixed with the fresh pine aroma around me. I leaned back against a nearby log, feeling the cool breeze on my face, staring into the fire. It felt good to be away from everything. But the peace didn't last long. As the night wore on, the forest seemed to come alive. Not with animals or birds, those sounds were normal, comforting. No, this was different. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Maybe it was the silence that fell between the noises of nature. It was almost as if the world had gone quiet for a moment. I pushed it out of my mind, deciding to call it an early night. It wasn't like me to get spooked easily, but something about being in this particular spot was starting to unsettle me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward my tent, my boots crunching on the dry leaves underfoot. As I zipped up the tent, I made sure my food was packed away in the bear-proof container I'd brought with me. I didn't want to attract any unwanted visitors. The night passed without much incident. At least nothing I noticed. I slept fitfully, tossing and turning. I'm used to sleeping under the stars, but this place felt different. My tent seemed smaller, the darkness outside deeper than I was used to. It was as if the forest was watching me. The next morning, I woke up early, well before the sun had fully risen. My mind was still reeling from the strange sensations of the previous night. I stretched and grabbed my coffee thermos, heading out of the tent for some fresh air. The morning mist was heavy in the air, the forest around me still dark and damp, as though it hadn't quite woken up yet. I decided to take a short hike to clear my head. There was a trail nearby that led to a small, secluded lake. I figured the exercise would do me good. The path was narrow, weaving through the trees, and the ground was soft from the morning dew. The cool air felt good against my face, but there was a heaviness to it, a weight that seemed to press in on me. I tried to shake the feeling of unease that had been building up inside me, but it was like trying to push a boulder uphill. Every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into something I couldn't escape. I was about half a mile into the hike when I noticed something strange. The trail had been well marked, but now the markers were gone. There were no more arrows on the trees, no more signs pointing the way. The path I'd been following seemed to disappear into the forest, swallowed up by the dense undergrowth. I stopped in my tracks, looking around. I wasn't lost. I knew that. I'd been hiking for years. I could read maps and I knew my way around the woods. But this was different. The forest looked different. The trees were taller than they should have been, and the underbrush seemed thicker than it had been on my way in. It was as though I had wandered into a different part of the forest without realizing it. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself. There was no sign of the lake on the map anymore. My heart started to race. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. It was just a mistake. I'd wandered off the path, that was all. But then, as I looked around, I realized something. There was no sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. The silence was almost deafening. I decided to backtrack. There had to be a turn I missed. But when I turned around, I couldn't find the trail. The familiar path I'd walked just minutes ago had vanished, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. Panic crept into my chest, but I tried to keep it under control. I wasn't lost. I wasn't. But the more I walked, the more I felt like I was trapped in a maze. The trees closed in around me, and I couldn't seem to find my way back to the camp. The sun was getting higher, but the trees kept the light at bay, casting everything in shadows. My mind raced, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back. My heart pounded in my ears. I checked my phone, no signal. Of course, I wasn't in an area with good reception. But still, I was starting to feel like I was in over my head. I took a few more steps, looking for any sign of the trail, but all I saw were the same trees and thick underbrush. There was no way out. Hours passed, or maybe it was only a few minutes. It felt like time had stopped. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen the trail markers. Every tree around me looked the same, and I was starting to feel a creeping dread in my chest. I had to stop and think. I knew I had to stay calm. I couldn't afford to panic out here. I remembered the survival tips I'd learned in my youth. I needed to stay hydrated, find shelter, and make sure I didn't do anything rash. But as the hours stretched on, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart skip a beat. And then, just as I was beginning to lose hope, I saw something. A break in the trees. A small clearing ahead, barely visible through the underbrush. My heart leaped with a mixture of relief and skepticism. I moved toward it, my steps cautious but eager. When I stepped into the clearing, I saw it. The lake. The same one I had been trying to find earlier. The water was calm, reflecting the trees and sky like a mirror. For the first time in hours, I felt a surge of hope. I wasn't lost after all. I was back on track. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few hours lift off my shoulders. I wasn't sure how I had missed the lake earlier, but at least I had found it now. I could make my way back to camp, retrace my steps, and everything would be fine. But then something stopped me. There, across the water, I saw someone, a figure, standing on the other side of the lake, watching me. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It wasn't anyone I had seen on my hike. The figure was just standing there, completely still, hidden among the trees, staring at me. I froze. I don't know why I didn't just turn and leave. Maybe it was the way the figure seemed to blend into the forest, almost like it was part of it. Maybe it was the stillness of it all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this person, or whatever it was waiting for me to make a move. I took a step back, slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. My heart started racing again, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I turned and made my way out of the clearing, my mind racing. The figure didn't move, not once. It was as if it wasn't real, but I knew it was. I kept walking. The forest didn't seem as dark anymore, and the path, my path, was beginning to reappear. It was as though the forest was letting me go, allowing me to find my way out. It didn't take long before I was back at my campsite. The fire had burned down to embers, but the sense of relief was overwhelming. I had made it back. I didn't know what I had seen at the lake, but I wasn't about to go back there to find out. I wasn't going to risk it. That night, I packed up my things and left. The The forest was no longer welcoming. The strange feeling I had tried to ignore for so long had grown into something I couldn't explain. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back. Not to that place. Not to that lake. Not to the forest that had felt so wrong. As I drove away, I looked back one last time. The forest stretched out behind me, dark and endless. But I was done with it. I was glad to be gone. I never found out who or what was on the other side of that lake. And honestly, I didn't want to. Some things are better left unexplored. Some things are meant to stay hidden. It was the first weekend of October, and I had decided to escape the city for a couple of days. The weather was crisp, with the hint of fall in the air, a perfect time to get away. I was 28, living in a small town called Chestnut Ridge, just north of Albany, and I had been craving some peace and quiet. A weekend camping trip seemed like the best way to clear my mind. I'd heard about a secluded camping spot deep in the woods off a trail, known only to a handful of locals. It wasn't a place you'd find on any map, and that was exactly what drew me in. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, and a few basic survival tools, and set off on a Saturday morning. By the time I reached the spot, it was late afternoon. The trailhead was barely marked, hidden behind overgrown brush. It took me about an hour to find my way in. The deeper I walked into the forest, the quieter it got. There was no sound except for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. The dense trees blocked out most of the fading sunlight, casting long shadows on the ground. It was perfect, just what I needed. I finally reached the campsite just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall, thick trees, with a stream running nearby, its sound soft but constant. There was a fire ring already set up, a few stones arranged around it. I wasn't sure how long this spot had been used, but it looked well maintained, maybe by hunters or hikers in the area. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, with a touch of wood smoke from a distant fire. Setting up my tent took a little longer than I anticipated, and by the time I finished, the sun had completely set. I gathered some dry wood from the forest floor, stacked it in the fire pit, and lit the match. The fire crackled to life, casting a warm glow against the darkening sky. I sat back, leaning against a tree, and stared into the flames. It felt good to be away from everything. No phone, no noise, just the crackling of fire and the sounds of nature around me. As the night wore on, the temperature began to drop. I added a couple more logs to the fire and crawled into my tent to get some rest. The silence outside was unnerving, but at the same time, it was peaceful. The only thing I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. I tried to ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. It was probably just the isolation of the place messing with my mind, I told myself. The next morning, I woke up to the sharp sound of a bird calling from somewhere nearby. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cool, damp air. The sky was overcast with clouds hanging low, and the ground was wet from dew. I stretched and took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh scent of the forest. There was a fresh layer of fog hanging in the valley, but the sun was breaking through, promising a warm afternoon. I spent the morning exploring the area around my campsite, wandering down to the stream. The water was cold and clear, rushing over smooth rocks. It wasn't deep, but it had a calming sound as it flowed. I found a spot along the bank to sit and just watch the water, lost in thought. It was so peaceful, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this relaxed. As noon approached, I went back to my camp, built up the fire, and began cooking lunch. The smell of sizzling bacon filled the air, making me feel even more content. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a strange set of tracks near my camp, big, heavy footprints. They looked like they had been left by someone wearing heavy boots. I froze, staring at the prints. They were too large to be my own, and I knew I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. For a moment, my heart rate picked up, and I wondered if I had stumbled across someone else's campsite or if I was being watched. But then, I convinced myself it was just some hiker or maybe a hunter passing through. I spent the rest of the day in the area, going for a long walk along the trail, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. The forest was thick, but every time I stopped to listen, I heard nothing but the wind. There was no one else around, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the nagging sense that I wasn't alone. The firelight flickered across the trees, casting strange shadows that seemed to shift and move. I kept hearing twigs snapping in the distance, too far away to pinpoint, but close enough to make me jump every now and then. I told myself it was just wildlife, bears maybe, or deer, but I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, the sound of something large moving in the underbrush nearby caught my attention. My first thought was that it was a bear, but it didn't sound like a bear. It was too methodical, almost like footsteps. I stood up, my heart pounding, and grabbed the nearest stick, ready to defend myself. The noise stopped for a moment, and I stood there, listening intently, but all I could hear was the wind. After what felt like hours, I reluctantly sat back down by the fire. The sound hadn't returned. Maybe I was just imagining things, I thought, but I kept my eyes peeled, staring into the darkness. The next day was when everything took a turn. I had been exploring a new part of the trail when I stumbled upon something strange, what looked like a series of markings on the trees. They weren't anything natural. They were too uniform, too deliberate. Long, vertical slashes carved into the bark. Some were deeper than others, and some had what looked like fresh scuff marks at the base of the trees, as if something had dragged itself along the ground. The air grew heavier as I stood there, looking at them. I had the distinct feeling that whatever had left these markings was not something I wanted to meet. I quickly made my way back to camp, my mind racing. I started packing up my things, deciding I'd leave the woods a day early. But just as I was about to pack up the tent, I heard a loud, unmistakable crunch of footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. The forest was still, too still. That was the breaking point. I grabbed everything I could and bolted out of the campsite. The forest seemed darker now, and the shadows of the trees seemed to close in around me. I didn't look back. I made it back to the trailhead by dusk, breathless and panicked. My truck was still parked where I had left it, and I wasted no time in getting inside and driving away. As I passed through the winding forest roads, I looked in my rearview mirror. The woods were behind me now, and as I pulled onto the main highway, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. I hadn't felt fear like that in a long time. I couldn't explain what had happened in those woods. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind, or maybe I had stumbled into something that was better left alone. Either way, I wasn't going back. The strange footprints, the markings on the trees, and the sense of being watched, those were things I would never forget. But I made it out. I made it out, and I was okay. The trip had been a reminder that sometimes, when you're alone in the wilderness, you're not always as alone as you think you are. And while I couldn't explain everything that happened, I'd learned one thing for sure. There are places in this world that are better left unexplored. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a simple camping trip to clear my mind and reconnect with nature. I'd been working nonstop for weeks, and the thought of spending a couple of days in the woods sounded like the perfect escape. A good friend, Alex, suggested we take the trip to a remote spot up in the mountains, about 2 hours from town. I wasn't too familiar with the place, but Alex had been there before, so I figured it would be safe enough. After all, it's just camping. We drove up late on Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect, and everything seemed fine. We took the last stretch of road off the beaten path, the dirt road leading us deeper into the wilderness. By the time we reached the camp spot, it was getting dark, but there was enough light left to set up the tent and start a fire. The air smelled fresh, clean, like pine trees and the earth itself. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional distant bark of an animal, probably a coyote or something. I tried not to think too much about it. It was quiet and peaceful, just the way I liked it. We set up camp by the edge of a small stream, its clear water flowing gently over rocks. It wasn't a large stream, but it had a calming sound that seemed to make the whole place feel more alive. The campfire crackled, casting shadows around the tent. Alex and I sat around it, making small talk about the week, sipping on beers, and enjoying the cool breeze that swept through the trees. We had planned to do a little hiking the next day, maybe fish in the stream, just the kind of peaceful weekend we both needed. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel a bit of unease, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the isolation, or the way the forest seemed to close in on us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe it was just me being tired. We went to bed around midnight, the sounds of the forest slowly fading as I drifted off to sleep. The tent was warm, and despite the strange sense of unease, I was comfortable enough to sleep deeply. But at around 3 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't a loud noise that woke me, but something subtle. The air felt different, and I could hear a strange rustling sound just outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't a typical wind noise. It sounded like something was moving through the brush, something large. My heart started to race, and I lay there trying to make sense of the sounds. The rustling was getting closer, and then it stopped. For what felt like forever, there was complete silence. I wanted to wake Alex, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. After all, we were in the wilderness. But then the rustling started again, much closer now, and I could hear the faint sound of something large stepping through the underbrush. My pulse quickened. It was too late for anything normal, like a deer or a raccoon. Felt wrong. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, like whatever it was knew we were here. I slowly reached for the flashlight by my side, trying not to make any noise. I held my breath as I shined the beam of light towards the tent door. Nothing. I waited, my mind racing. Was it just an animal? My rational side told me it was, but the more I listened, the more I doubted it. Then came the sound of something tapping on the tent. Not a scrape or scratch, but a soft tap, like something was gently pressing against it from the outside. I froze. It lasted for only a second, but it was enough to send a chill up my spine. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to unzip the tent and look outside, but I didn't. What if whatever was out there was watching us? What if it wasn't just a bear or something? The tapping stopped, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. After what felt like hours, I finally mustered the courage to peek through the small gap in the tent's zipper, shining the flashlight outwards. But there was nothing there, just the trees, the darkness, and the stream in the distance. I convinced myself it was nothing, just an animal or the wind playing tricks on me. Slowly, I let the tension leave my body and tried to go back to sleep, but it was impossible now. I lay awake, staring at the inside of the tent, my thoughts racing. The tapping kept playing in my mind, over and over. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping, the sunlight breaking through the trees and warming the tent. Alex was still asleep beside me, snoring lightly. I felt exhausted, but I didn't want to disturb him. I decided to step outside for a bit, take a walk, and clear my head. The cool morning air hit me as I unzipped the tent, and I stepped out into the woods, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The campsite looked normal in the daylight, but something about it felt different. Maybe it was just my nerves, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, as if expecting to see someone, or something, watching me from the trees. I walked down to the stream, hoping the sound of the flowing water would calm me, but even that didn't seem to help. After a while, I started to feel like I was being followed, though when I turned around, no one was there. It was like I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, just faint enough to make me question whether I was imagining things. I shook my head and told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, after all. When I returned to camp, Alex was awake, sitting by the fire, looking at the map of trails. He didn't mention anything about the strange noises from the night before, and I didn't bring it up either. I didn't want to sound crazy. We spent the rest of the day hiking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We explored the trails, tried our luck fishing in the stream, and even cooked some lunch by the fire, but the unease never left me. As the sun started to set, I couldn't help but notice that the woods seemed quieter than before. The birds were silent, and the usual rustling of animals had stopped. Even the stream seemed to be quieter, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. We decided to head back to camp early that evening, the weird feeling creeping up on me more with each passing minute. When we got back, everything seemed normal, but as we were sitting around the fire, I noticed something strange. There, just at the edge of the trees, was a faint, distant shape. It wasn't big, but it was dark and out of place against the backdrop of the trees. It almost looked like someone was standing there, watching us. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there, just out of sight. I tried to brush it off, but it was hard to ignore. That night, I decided to keep the flashlight next to me as I tried to sleep. I didn't want to risk hearing that tapping again. I managed to sleep for a few hours, but I woke up again around 2 a.m. This time, there was no rustling or tapping. There was only complete silence. And then, the silence broke with a low, distant howl. It wasn't a wolf. It was something deeper, more guttural, like an animal trying to sound human. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever had been out there the night before was still out there, watching us. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left, the unease never leaving me. The drive back home was long, but I didn't feel safe until we were out of the woods. I still can't explain what happened that weekend, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that spot again. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend getaway. Just me, the woods, and my thoughts. A break from the hustle and bustle of the city. I had been feeling the weight of work and responsibilities pulling me down for months. So when I finally found a free weekend in my schedule, I decided to get away. No distractions, no phone calls, just me and nature. I drove out to a remote camping spot I found online. It was tucked away deep in the forest, a good couple of hours from any town. The kind of place most people wouldn't even think to visit, which was exactly what I was looking for. I'd been camping a few times before, but this would be my first time camping alone. The idea both excited and unnerved me, but the excitement won over. I packed light: a tent, sleeping bag, some food, a first aid kit, and a couple of flashlights. I didn't want to carry too much, as I planned on doing some hiking. The weather forecast said it would be a clear, crisp weekend, perfect for spending time outdoors. I had a map, a compass, and a solid sense of direction. It didn't seem like there was much that could go wrong. The drive was scenic, the road winding through dense forest, the air fresh and crisp as I rolled down the windows to let the scent of pine fill the car. The deeper I went into the woods, the more isolated everything felt. Eventually, I reached the trailhead, a dirt road barely wide enough for my car to fit through. I parked, grabbed my gear, and started walking down the path that would lead me to the campsite. The first few hours were peaceful. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush, and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. I set up my tent beside a small creek, its steady gurgling providing a soothing background sound. After settling in, I made a quick campfire, knowing that the evenings in the forest could get chilly. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the temperature dropped quickly. I had a small stove to heat up some food, nothing fancy, just a simple can of soup and some crackers. The fire crackled softly in front of me, the orange glow casting long shadows on the trees surrounding me. I sat back, taking in the view. It was beautiful here, quiet, far removed from the noise of everyday life. But as night fell, something began to shift. At first, it was subtle, just the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself that it was nothing. After all, I was in the middle of a forest. There were animals everywhere: deer, bears, raccoons. They were probably just curious about the fire. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. I tried to distract myself by reading, but every so often, I'd glance up, feeling like something was moving just beyond the firelight. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would help ease the unease. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the strange noise coming from the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. My mind kept returning to the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I had been alone for hours, and I knew there were no other campers nearby. Still, I couldn't help but feel anxious. Around midnight, I woke up to a sharp, unmistakable sound. Something heavy moving through the forest. It wasn't the wind or a small animal. It was the sound of something large, something deliberate. I lay there in my tent, frozen, listening. The sound came closer, moving in a slow, methodical pattern, like whatever it was circling my camp. My heart raced, my thoughts went wild, and I suddenly wished I had a way to reach someone. Anyone. I thought about grabbing my phone, but then I remembered there was no service out here. I was completely cut off. I held my breath, trying to listen. The noise was now on the other side of my tent, just beyond the thin fabric. My mind raced through all sorts of possibilities. A bear? Person? Or something else entirely? The thought that it could be another human made my stomach turn. What would they want out here in the middle of nowhere? I listened for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. The noise seemed to shift, moving further away, then coming back closer. My eyes darted around the tent, looking for any sign of movement in the dark. I was too afraid to make a sound. If it was a bear, I didn't want to risk attracting it. But if it was a person, what were they doing out here so deep in the forest? The next morning, I woke up with the sun, the events of the night before weighing heavily on my mind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a deer or some other animal. I stood up, stretched, and grabbed my backpack to go for a hike. Maybe a good walk would clear my head. As I was packing up my gear, I noticed something odd. The area around my camp, where I had left my gear and food the night before, was disturbed. The bags had been shifted. Some of the food I had left out was gone, and my campfire was almost entirely put out, as if someone or something had stomped on it. I couldn't remember hearing anything during the night, but now that I looked, the evidence was clear. My heart pounded in my chest. Who or what had been here? I didn't stick around to find out. My instinct told me to pack up and leave. The sun was high now, and the feeling of being watched had not gone away. I packed my things quickly, avoiding any unnecessary noise. I knew that I should have stayed calm, but something inside me told me to leave. The air felt thick, heavy, and the forest no longer seemed welcoming. It was as if something had changed overnight, something I couldn't explain but could feel in every fiber of my being. I hiked out of the campsite, keeping my eyes and ears sharp, and it felt like I was walking through a tunnel, unable to shake the sense that I was being followed. The same rustling noises from the night before followed me at a distance, too distant for me to be sure, but close enough to make my skin crawl. I kept moving, knowing that the quicker I reached the trailhead, the safer I'd feel. When I finally emerged from the woods and saw my car parked at the edge of the trail, relief flooded over me. I didn't even bother looking back at the forest as I threw my gear in the back of the car and sped off. The uneasy feeling didn't leave me until I was miles away, on my way home, but I couldn't shake the nagging thought that something had been out there with me. In the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me, telling myself that I had overreacted. Maybe it was just a curious bear or some other animal that had gotten too close for comfort. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Whatever had been out there, watching me, had made its presence known in a way I couldn't ignore. I'd gone camping alone to escape, to find peace. But what I found in those woods wasn't peace. It was something else entirely, something I'll never forget. And while I might go camping again someday, I'll never be able to shake the feeling that there's something watching me, waiting just beyond the trees. It had been years since I'd gone camping. Life had gotten busy, and what was once a peaceful escape to the woods became a distant memory. But this summer, I decided I needed it again. I needed to disconnect. The noise of the city, work, and social media had slowly drained the joy I once had in just existing. So, on a quiet Friday morning in early August 2023, I packed my things into the back of my old SUV and drove to a campsite about 50 miles north of my hometown in northern Wisconsin. The area was known for its serenity, a perfect spot to escape from the hustle and bustle. I had been here before when I was younger, but I had forgotten much of it. I didn't even remember the exact trailhead to the campgrounds, but I was confident I could find it again. The last time I was there, I had been with a group of friends, but this time it was just me. I wanted the solitude. As I drove through the winding country roads, the trees grew thicker and the landscape more isolated. The air felt different. There was a certain crispness to it that made me feel like I was truly getting away from everything. After an hour or so, I finally reached the small, gravel parking lot at the trailhead. There were no other cars, which surprised me. Usually, this spot was busy during the summer months, but I was grateful for the solitude. I grabbed my backpack, made sure I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, flashlight, and extra layers, and set off down the trail. At first, it was easy to follow. The path was wide, clear, and well-trodden. I was feeling good about my decision to take this trip. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I'd walked for about 30 minutes when I came across an old wooden sign nailed to a tree. The paint was chipped, but I could still make out the faded letters, Camp Whispering Pines. I smiled, remembering how my friends and I used to joke about the name. It sounded so cheesy, but it was home to some great memories. I was about halfway to the campsite when I noticed something odd. The trail began to narrow. It wasn't as well maintained as it had been earlier, and I had to step over a few fallen branches. I stopped for a moment, unsure of whether I should continue down this path. But the thought of reaching the campsite and settling in for the night pushed me forward. As I walked, the woods seemed to grow quieter. It wasn't just the absence of animals. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. The trees stood closer together, their trunks twisting upward, blocking out more and more light. The air had a strange, damp smell, and I could feel a slight chill creep in, despite it being mid-afternoon. I brushed it off as nothing, just the natural shift in weather. It wasn't until I reached a fork in the trail that I started to feel a little uneasy. One path seemed well used, with stones placed neatly along the edge. The other was barely noticeable, barely even a trail at all. It looked almost forgotten, as if no one had walked it in years. Normally, I would have just taken the main trail, but something about the forgotten path called to me. The curiosity was stronger than the caution, so I took the path less traveled. As soon as I stepped onto the narrow trail, the temperature dropped. The sun had started to dip behind the trees, and the forest seemed darker, more enclosed. I pushed on, ignoring the uncomfortable sensation creeping up my spine. The trail twisted in odd ways, leading me deeper into the forest, and as I walked, the silence grew heavier. The occasional rustle of leaves, the chirping of insects, everything had stopped. It was as if the entire forest had gone still. I reached a clearing, and in the center there was a small creek. The water was clear, but something about it felt off. It wasn't the kind of serene, peaceful creek I was used to seeing. This one seemed ancient. The rocks around the edges were worn smooth, the water flowing in a steady stream that didn't seem to match the rest of the quiet, still air. I decided to stop and refill my water bottle. As I crouched down to fill it, I noticed a strange object half buried in the dirt nearby. It was a small, rusted metal box. I wiped the dirt away, curious about what it might be. It was old, covered in moss, and looked like it had been there for decades. I tried to open it, but it was stuck. After a few moments, I managed to pry it open with a stick. Inside, there was a weathered, crumpled piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. It was a map, though not one I recognized. It seemed to show the trail I had been following, but with additional markings. Dotted lines leading to a small X deep in the woods. I felt a sudden urge to follow it. The map had no explanation, no instructions, just the markings and the X. I don't know why, but I tucked the map into my backpack and stood up, deciding to follow the creek and see where it led. The further I walked, the more the forest seemed to close in on me. The trees became denser, their branches twisting into each other above, blocking out most of the remaining sunlight. As the light grew dimmer, I started to regret my decision. I should have turned back when I had the chance, but now the curiosity was stronger than the doubt. The path grew narrower and harder to follow, but I pressed on. Eventually, I reached the X marked on the map. There, in the middle of the forest, was an old, crumbling cabin. It was barely standing, its wood rotting away with age. The windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I was drawn to it. I had to get closer. I cautiously stepped up to the cabin, pushing the door open. The inside was dark, the air musty and stale. I could feel the weight of the years pressing down on me. Everything was covered in dust, cobwebs, and decay. A broken chair lay overturned in the corner, and a rusted stove sat in the center of the room. But there was something strange about the atmosphere. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quickly stepped back outside, my heart racing. I stood there, staring at the cabin. What was it doing here? Why had no one mentioned it? This place was supposed to be untouched. I thought about the map again and the fact that it had led me here. The deeper I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I made my way back down the trail, feeling the weight of the forest around me. The strange silence returned, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I had found something old, forgotten by time, and it had felt wrong. I didn't know what it was, but the air felt heavier now, like I had disturbed something that was better left undisturbed. By the time I reached the trailhead again, the sky had darkened completely, and the air had taken on a crisp chill. I didn't look back as I hurried to my car. I drove away, not stopping until I was back in town. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the cabin lingered in my mind, haunting me. What had I discovered out there? Had I just stumbled upon an old relic of the past? Or had I opened a door to something better left forgotten? But when I looked at the map again, I noticed something I had missed before. The X had been marked in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if it was waiting for someone to find it. And in the silence of the night, I realized that whatever I had uncovered out there in those woods might never truly be forgotten. It was the summer of 2022 when I decided to head out on a solo camping trip. I needed time away from everything: work, the noise of the city, and the constant pressure to be connected. I grew up in Vermont, so I was familiar with the outdoors, but this time I chose a remote spot in the Adirondacks. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for, but I hoped to find some peace and maybe a bit of clarity. I had planned everything meticulously. I was well prepared with a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for the temperature, enough food and water, and my trusty backpack with all the gear I might need. I even researched the area extensively to make sure I knew the trails, the wildlife, and the potential dangers. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, just me and nature. I arrived at the trailhead around noon, the sun high in the sky. The air was warm, but a slight breeze kept things comfortable. I should have felt at ease, but something about the area made me feel on edge. It wasn't anything specific, but a quiet unease settled in my gut. I shook it off and began my hike. The path was narrow, winding through dense trees. There was no one around, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and leaves. The hike was a bit more difficult than I had anticipated. The trail was steeper in places, and the weather had made the ground slick in others. I took my time, knowing there was no rush. I reached the campsite in the early evening, a small clearing near a stream. The sounds of the water rushing over the rocks were calming, and the gentle rustling of the trees overhead created a natural lullaby. Setting up camp took longer than expected. I had a bit of trouble getting the tent up because the ground was uneven in places, but eventually, it was done. I felt accomplished, but the unease that had settled in my stomach hadn't quite left. I figured I was just being paranoid, so I pushed it aside and started on dinner, some dehydrated meals I'd brought along. As I ate, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. There were no birds, no insects, not even the wind rustling through the trees. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I glanced around, scanning the shadows between the trees, but there was nothing. I tried to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. After dinner, I sat by the fire watching the flames dance. It was nice in a way. The warmth from the fire was soothing, and the sound of the crackling would reminded me of when I was younger, sitting around a campfire with friends. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest had grown too silent. I tried to distract myself, reading a book I had packed, but my mind kept wandering. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but it felt as if the forest was watching me. As the fire burned low, I decided it was time to go to bed. The night was clear, and the stars overhead were breathtaking. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to settle into my sleeping bag. But sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound outside the tent made my heart race. I was starting to feel paranoid, convinced that something was out there, just waiting for the right moment. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint noise, like footsteps, coming from the direction of the trees. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was moving toward my camp. My mind raced. Was it another camper? A hiker who had gotten lost? But there was something off about it. The steps were too heavy, too methodical. I felt a chill run through me, and for a moment, I considered leaving, packing up and heading back to the trailhead. But I was miles from the nearest road, and it was pitch dark. My mind spun in circles as I waited, too terrified to move. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the tent fabric. My breath caught in my throat, and I dared not move. It felt like the air had grown thick, the tension almost unbearable. Whoever or whatever was outside seemed to be toying with me. I could hear soft rustling, as if something was circling the tent. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, and I couldn't make a sound. The scraping continued for a while before it stopped, and once again, there was only silence. The footsteps, the rustling, everything had vanished. I lay there in the dark, wide awake, not daring to move or make a sound. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually, I must have fallen asleep, exhausted from the fear and the adrenaline. The next morning, I woke up with the sun, feeling a strange sense of relief. The events of the previous night still lingered in my mind, but I tried to push them aside. I told myself I had imagined things, that it was just the wind or an animal that had gotten too close to my tent. Still, the unease remained. I decided to pack up and leave early. I didn't want to stay another night in that same spot. It felt as if the forest was hiding something I wasn't meant to know. As I packed my gear, I noticed something strange. There were no footprints around the camp. The ground was soft, and any tracks would have been easy to spot. But there was nothing at all. Not a single sign that someone or something had been there. I left the campsite as quickly as I could, retracing my steps along the trail, my heart still pounding. The air felt different now, warmer, somehow, and the forest didn't feel as oppressive. The further I walked, the more my nerves settled, and by the time I reached the trailhead, I felt like I could breathe again. As I drove back home, I couldn't help but think about what had happened. There was no logical explanation for it. No footprints, no signs of any human presence. And yet I had heard something or someone walking around my camp. Was I just imagining things? Or had something been out there, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake? I never went back to that part of the Adirondacks. I still go camping, but I stick to places that are more populated, where I feel a sense of security. I never told anyone about that night. I don't think they'd believe me, but I know what I heard, what I felt, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing that something was just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting. That trip changed me. It taught me that nature can be beautiful, but it can also be unpredictable and unforgiving. I was lucky to make it out of there unscathed. The next time I head out into the wilderness, I'll be more cautious, more aware of the things that lie hidden in the shadows. Because sometimes the things that make the most noise are the ones that stay the quietest. I wasn't expecting much when I decided to get away for a weekend alone in the mountains. The cabin I found on a local booking site seemed rustic but cozy. It was a good deal for a 2-day escape from the grind. I needed a break from everything. The noise, the constant buzzing of my phone, the city that never slept. The cabin was about 3 hours away from where I lived, tucked deep into the forest, hidden by the towering pine trees. When I first arrived, I was struck by how isolated it felt. It was perfect. The nearest town was nearly an hour's drive away, and the road that led to the cabin seemed to disappear into the wilderness. The house itself was small, just one room with a loft, but it had everything I needed. A wood stove in the corner, a few old but sturdy-looking chairs, a worn-out kitchen, and a large window that overlooked the woods. I unpacked quickly, settling into the space as the sun began to dip below the horizon. It wasn't long before the chill of the mountain air crept in through the cracks of the wooden walls. So I started a fire in the stove and curled up on the couch with a book. The sound of the crackling fire was soothing, and soon I found myself nodding off, the warmth of the flames lulling me to sleep. When I woke up, it was dark outside, the stars barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. I glanced at my phone. No signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. That's why I came here. The isolation was exactly what I needed. After a few minutes of just sitting in the quiet, I decided to step outside and get some fresh air. The night was eerily still. The air was crisp and sharp, and the silence seemed to stretch on forever. I looked around, trying to get my bearings in the darkness. I could see nothing but trees. There was no sign of life, no animals moving about, just the cold and the isolation. That's when I heard it, a soft sound, like something shifting in the underbrush. I froze, listening carefully, my heart beating a little faster. But after a few moments, the sound faded, and all I could hear was the wind through the trees. I shook my head. I was just overreacting, I told myself. It was probably just an animal. I took a deep breath and turned back toward the cabin, my footsteps crunching in the snow. But then, just as I reached for the door handle, I heard it again, this time louder, a rustling sound, followed by something scraping across the ground. I turned quickly, scanning the dark forest behind me. Nothing. I stood there for a few more minutes, staring into the blackness, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The woods were still. It was too still. I decided it was time to go inside. I locked the door behind me, more out of instinct than any real concern. I didn't feel scared, not exactly, but something about the night unsettled me. I sat down by the fire again, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. As I sat there, my mind wandered to the cabin's history. The owner had mentioned that it had been around for decades, maybe longer, but I didn't know much more. It wasn't unusual for places like this to have some kind of backstory, some rumors attached to them. Maybe the previous owners had heard strange things too. I laughed at myself for being so jumpy. I was an adult, not some kid scared of shadows. But the feeling wouldn't leave. It lingered, sitting like a weight on my chest. Every crack of the wood in the stove, every shift of the furniture in the old house seemed amplified, like a signal of something approaching. The night passed without incident, though I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up, listening to the wind howling outside and the distant sounds of animals moving through the trees. Each time I drifted off, I was jolted awake by some sound in the distance, but every time I went to the window to look, there was nothing. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to enjoy the day. I made myself some breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, and then stepped outside to stretch my legs. The air was cold but refreshing, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. I decided to go for a hike. The area around the cabin was beautiful, and I figured a walk through the forest would clear my mind. I packed a small backpack with some water and a snack, then headed down the narrow trail that led into the woods. For a few hours, everything was peaceful. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. The sun gradually climbed higher in the sky, filtering through the branches and casting long shadows on the forest floor. It was the kind of quiet I had been longing for, perfect solitude. But then, something changed. The deeper I went into the forest, the quieter it became. It wasn't just the absence of birds or animals. It was the absence of any sound at all. The wind stopped, and even the trees seemed still. I felt it again, the same uneasy sensation I'd had the night before. Something was wrong. I paused for a moment, listening. Nothing. Not a single sound. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. Instead, I pressed on, telling myself that I was overthinking everything. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a flash of movement between the trees. I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something similar. But when I looked closer, I saw nothing. No animal. Just the same trees, the same snow-covered ground. But then I heard it. A soft, slow scrape, like something dragging across the forest floor. I spun around, my heart racing, but I saw nothing. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I turned to go back to the cabin, my mind racing, but the path I'd taken was suddenly unclear. The trees seemed to shift, the trail less defined. I walked for what felt like hours, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I would hear that scraping sound again, and each time it seemed to be closer. Finally, after what felt like forever, I broke through the trees and saw the cabin in the distance. I quickened my pace, my legs aching, my mind frantic. I didn't even look behind me, I just ran. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me, my chest heaving, my breath coming in short gasps. I was safe, I told myself. Nothing could touch me here. I stayed inside the rest of the day, refusing to go back out. I tried to convince myself that I was being irrational, that there was nothing out there, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I stayed up late, watching the fire, jumping at every sound outside. The wind howled, the trees creaked, and for the first time, I was truly afraid. But nothing happened. By morning, I was exhausted. I decided to leave the cabin early, pack up my things, and head back to civilization. The drive home was quiet, the sun breaking through the clouds in a way that almost seemed too peaceful, too perfect for what had just happened. I never found out what made that scraping sound in the woods. I never figured out why the air had felt so heavy, or why the trail seemed to shift under my feet. But I do know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that cabin. Some things are best left unexplained, and I've learned to trust that feeling in your gut that tells you when something isn't quite right. I always thought I was the kind of person who didn't get easily spooked. Growing up in Vermont, surrounded by thick forests and mountains, I'd spent countless nights camping, hiking, and exploring. But that all changed one winter. It started as an idea for a quick getaway to clear my mind. I was 28, fresh out of a messy breakup, and looking for some solitude. I didn't want to go to a crowded city, and the idea of a quiet cabin in the woods seemed perfect. It was December, and the forecast had promised heavy snow, but I didn't mind. I'd always found peace in nature, especially when the world was blanketed in white. I rented a small, secluded cabin in the Adirondack Mountains, far enough from any towns to feel truly alone. The cabin was old, built from rough-hewn logs with a wood stove in the center to keep it warm. There was no electricity or running water, just a well in the backyard and a fireplace that was almost more for ambience than warmth. The kind of place you go to escape. I packed light, some clothes, a few books, a bottle of whiskey, and a portable heater to help with the cold. The cabin was remote, but that didn't bother me. It felt like the perfect place to unwind. I didn't think much about the stories I'd heard of people getting lost in the woods, of hikers stumbling across things they couldn't explain. It all seemed like old folklore, stories meant to be told around campfires. When I arrived, the weather had already turned, with snowflakes swirling around like they were trapped in the wind. The path leading to the cabin was hard to find under the snow, but I managed to make my way up with a small shovel and my boots. The cabin came into view as I crested the small hill, nestled in between the trees. A small, wooden porch wrapped around the front, and I could see the faint glow of a small lantern inside the window. The first night I settled in easily. The fire in the stove crackled and popped, the warmth spreading throughout the room. I opened the bottle of whiskey and poured myself a drink, watching the snow fall outside. The cabin creaked every now and then, as old wood does, and the wind howled around the edges of the building. But that was it. The silence was welcome, felt like the world had paused, just for me. I spent the next few days exploring the surrounding woods. It was peaceful. The snow covered everything, turning the world into a giant, white canvas. There was something calming about the isolation. It was easy to forget the stress of everyday life when you were alone in such a serene place. But then things started to change. On the fourth day, I woke up early, before the sun had fully risen, to the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too steady. They were human. I hesitated, listening for a moment. The footsteps didn't stop. They circled the cabin slowly, as if whoever it was waiting for something, or perhaps just observing. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was someone else staying nearby. I went outside with my rifle, just in case, but there was no sign of anyone. The snow was untouched around the cabin, and the forest beyond looked still and undisturbed. The only footprints in the snow were my own from the day before. Still, something didn't sit right with me. That evening, after a long day of hiking, I locked the door before going to bed. I didn't usually do that, but I had this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I chalked it up to being on edge, the isolation getting to me. It wasn't like I was in a dangerous place. I was miles from civilization, but there was something unsettling about the silence of it all. That night, I slept poorly. Every time the wind howled, I imagined someone standing just outside the cabin, watching me. I would wake up, heart racing, but find nothing when I checked. The following day, I decided to head into town for supplies. I wanted to shake the strange feeling I had. I didn't want to leave, but I knew I needed to get out for a bit. As I made my way back down the winding path toward the main road, I noticed something strange. There were fresh tracks in the snow, footprints, bigger than mine, leading away from the cabin. I felt a chill run through me. They were new, not from the day before. I hadn't noticed them when I first walked down the path, but now they were impossible to ignore. I followed them for a while, until they disappeared into the trees. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was being followed. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. I spent the rest of the day in town, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I told myself I was overreacting, but as I made my way back to the cabin that evening, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. When I returned, everything seemed fine. The cabin was still standing, the smoke from the chimney rising lazily into the sky. But there was something else, something I couldn't place. The air felt heavier. As I stepped inside, I immediately noticed something was different. The wood stove was colder than it should have been, and the door, which I had locked before I left, was slightly ajar. Quickly closed it, my heart pounding. I checked the rest of the cabin, but everything seemed normal. Still, the unease lingered. I spent the night staring at the fire, listening for any sounds outside, but nothing came. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things and left the cabin. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation getting to me, or if there really was someone out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I wasn't a coward, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out either. On my way out, I spotted something strange. Near the edge of the property, hidden under some bushes, was a bundle of old clothes, dirty and tattered. I approached carefully, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. It was almost as if someone had left them there on purpose, to be found. I left the cabin, my mind racing. Who had been watching me? Who had been walking around my cabin, leaving footprints in the snow? And why did I feel like I was being followed? I drove away that day, not looking back. The cabin, the forest, the footsteps, they all faded into the distance. When I got home, I tried to put it out of my mind. It was just a bad experience, I thought. Just the product of too much isolation, too much time in the woods. But every now and then, I think back to that cabin, to the footsteps, and I wonder if I was really alone out there. Something about that place, that feeling of being watched, stayed with me long after I left. And now, every time I find myself out in the woods, even in broad daylight, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. The autumn chill had already set in when I found myself on the worn-out gravel road that led to the cabin. I had been planning this solo trip for months, a retreat of sorts to clear my mind after a chaotic few months at work. With everything happening around me, I needed to disconnect, focus on myself, and escape to the solitude of the woods. The cabin, situated a few hours north of my town, was in a secluded area, surrounded by thick trees that stood like silent sentinels. It wasn't a new place for me. In fact, I'd visited a few years ago, but that trip ended abruptly due to a snowstorm that blocked off the roads. I'd been back to the area several times, but never for such a long stretch. I wanted the isolation this time, no distractions, no commitments, just the forest, the cabin, and me. As I turned onto the long driveway that led to the cabin, the air felt heavier, almost thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trees on either side were beginning to shed their leaves, creating a carpet of orange and brown. The clouds above were low, like they were pressing down on the earth. It was quiet, too quiet almost, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. The cabin itself looked the same as I remembered. A small, one-story structure made of dark wood. Its roof sloped steeply to prevent snow buildup. It had no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a wood-burning stove inside to keep it warm. There was something charming about it, a sort of rustic, unpolished beauty that made it feel like it was part of the landscape. I parked my car near the small clearing in front, grabbed my gear from the trunk, and walked up the wooden steps to the porch. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, a sound that somehow made the place feel more alive. Inside, the air was cool but dry. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture, showing it hadn't been lived in for a while. The smell of wood and leather lingered in the air. There was a certain comfort in the space, an odd kind of peace. I dropped my bags near the small wooden table in the center of the room, set up a few things, and started a fire in the stove. The warmth slowly spread through the room, and I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. I unpacked the few items I'd brought with me: books, a journal, my camera, and some snacks, and settled in for the night. The fire crackled softly as I pulled out my journal and started writing about the trip. The day had been long, and my mind was filled with thoughts. Despite the peaceful setting, there was an underlying unease that gnawed at me, something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the isolation, the complete absence of other people. It felt strange, even though I was accustomed to solitude. Night fell quickly, and the cabin grew darker. The only light came from the fire, casting shadows that danced on the walls. I had no plans for the evening other than to relax and enjoy the stillness, but something about the growing darkness made the silence feel heavy. After dinner, I spent some time outside, just walking around the cabin, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches swaying softly in the wind. I felt like I was being watched, but I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I went to bed early that night, the only sound being the crackling of the fire in the stove. The sheets were rough but warm, and I drifted off to sleep, the scent of wood filling my senses. The next morning, I woke up early, the first light of dawn creeping through the small window above the bed. It was a cool, crisp morning, and the air smelled fresh, like the forest had just woken up with me. I got out of bed, stretched, and made my way to the stove to start the fire again. The morning was calm, the silence of the forest broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. I decided to go for a hike that morning. There was a trail not far from the cabin that led deeper into the woods, and I thought it would be a good way to explore and take some photos. I grabbed my camera and a few essentials, locked the cabin door, and headed out into the woods. The trail was narrow, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to stretch up forever. The ground beneath me was soft, covered in layers of fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps. I took my time, stopping to photograph the scenery and admire the beauty of the forest. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the trail. It felt good to be out here, away from everything. But as I walked deeper into the woods, I began to feel a slight unease again. The woods were still, too still. No animals, no birds, just silence. I paused at a small clearing, checking my camera to make sure everything was working. The silence around me was thick, oppressive. It felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being completely alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around to head back to the cabin, but something in the distance caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe my mind playing games with me. But no, there was definitely something there. A figure standing motionless at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence. My heart started to race. Could have been someone else out here, another hiker, but the more I stared, the more certain I became that it wasn't a person at all. Without thinking, I turned and started walking quickly back toward the cabin. My breath quickened as I pushed myself through the underbrush, but the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. The trees felt like they were closing in around me. I could hear nothing but my own breath and the sound of my footsteps. Finally, I reached the cabin, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The walls of the cabin, though familiar, felt claustrophobic now. I closed the door behind me and locked it, leaning against it for a moment, trying to calm myself down. My heart was still pounding, and I could feel the sweat beating on my forehead. I knew it was just my imagination, but the feeling that something was wrong was too strong to ignore. I spent the rest of the day indoors, too shaken to venture back out. The sense of unease didn't leave, lingering like a dark cloud over everything I did. The evening came quickly, and I made a simple dinner, but the stillness of the cabin only made things worse. I had hoped that a second night would feel different, but it didn't. The silence was deafening. At around midnight, I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. I kept hearing things outside, faint noises, like footsteps or the rustling of leaves. Every time I turned my head to listen more closely, the sound would stop. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I lay awake for hours, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. Finally, around 3 a.m., I decided to check outside. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, scanning the area around the cabin. There was nothing unusual, just the quiet woods and the flickering light of the fire I'd left going inside. But then I saw it, a faint outline of a figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, watching me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door shut, bolted it, and rushed to the window to peek through the blinds. No one was there. I stared at the spot where I had seen the figure, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life. The rest of my stay at the cabin was uneventful, though the sense of unease never fully left me. I couldn't explain what had happened out there, and maybe it was nothing. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But when I finally packed up and left, I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I drove away. The woods seemed to fade behind me, and I was once again part of the world I knew. The cabin had given me the solitude I'd sought, but it had also shown me that sometimes the silence can hide things we don't want to see. It was the middle of September when I decided to take some time off. After a long stretch of work, I was burned out. A couple of weeks of peace and quiet in the wilderness seemed like the perfect remedy. I found a small cabin in the woods of northern Vermont, tucked away from everything and everyone. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a place to disconnect and recharge. The cabin was located about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, a bit remote but accessible enough if you had the right vehicle. I made sure to bring my old Jeep, equipped with four-wheel drive. The roads leading up to the cabin were unpaved, winding and uneven, with tall trees flanking both sides. I loved the isolation, the way everything around me felt so far removed from the bustle of everyday life. When I arrived at the cabin, it was exactly what I'd expected: small, wooden, with a stone chimney, a weathered porch, and a few windows that gave you a glimpse of the surrounding woods. There was a fire pit outside, a small shed beside the cabin, and a small creek that ran a few hundred yards down the hill. The air was crisp, and the leaves were just starting to change colors. It felt like the perfect escape. I unloaded my bags and set up inside. There was a nice kitchen area, a cozy living room with an old wood stove, and a small bedroom with a double bed. It was quiet, peaceful, and honestly, a bit too perfect. I didn't know it at the time, but that cabin would become something more than just a retreat for me. It would turn into something that changed me in ways I could never have anticipated. The first night was calm. I cooked myself a simple dinner, sat by the fire, and drank a beer as the sun set. I watched the fading light dance across the trees and listened to the sounds of the woods. There was something comforting about the way the wind rustled the leaves, the occasional bird call, and the distant sound of the creek. Felt like home. After a few hours, I turned in for bed, feeling content and ready to relax. The next day, I decided to go for a hike. I wasn't expecting to get too far, just wanted to stretch my legs and explore the area around the cabin. There was a narrow path that led up the hill behind the cabin, and I figured I'd follow it. The trail wasn't marked, but it seemed well-worn enough. I had been walking for a good hour, enjoying the serenity, when I noticed something odd. There was an old, overgrown structure about 30 feet off the trail. At first, I thought it might be a shed or a small cabin, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It looked more like a ruin, a set of crumbling stone walls surrounded by thick bushes and trees. It was strange, almost like it didn't belong. The place felt off, but not in a way that made me want to turn around. It was just strange. I walked up to it, pushing aside the brambles and vines that had grown up around it. The stone walls were weathered, with moss covering most of the surfaces. There were remnants of what looked like old wooden beams lying around, decayed and fallen. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. But what stood out the most was the strange feeling I had as I stood there. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I decided to take a few pictures, not for any particular reason, just to document the oddity of it. I snapped a few shots and then turned back to the path. But as I made my way back down the hill, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything overt, just a vague sense that someone or something was watching me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But the feeling lingered. The rest of the day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon reading, then went for a short walk by the creek, where I sat on a rock and watched the water flow. That night, I sat outside for a while, enjoying the silence, before heading to bed early. The next few days passed in a similar fashion, hiking, reading, and enjoying the solitude. But by the fourth day, something strange started happening. I began to hear sounds in the woods at night. At first, it was subtle branches snapping, the distant rustle of leaves, but over time, it became more distinct. I would hear footsteps, the crunch of dirt under boots, and even faint voices. But when I would get up and look around, there was nothing, just the trees and the quiet darkness. I chalked it up to the usual paranoia that comes with being alone in the woods for too long. I was probably just overthinking things. But the more it happened, the more I began to wonder. I wasn't scared, per se, but it was unsettling. And then there was the smell. On the fifth night, as I was cooking dinner, I caught a strange scent in the air. It wasn't anything overpowering, but it was odd. It was like damp earth mixed with something metallic. I couldn't place it, but it made my skin crawl a little. I decided to step outside for some fresh air. As I opened the door to the porch, the scent grew stronger. I looked around, but the woods were silent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the footsteps again. Only this time, they were closer. I could hear them moving around the perimeter of the cabin. Slowly, cautiously, my heart started to race, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside the window, and I could feel my skin tightening with fear. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just lay there, waiting for whatever was out there to move on. But it didn't. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin, as though someone was walking around it, trying to find a way in. I don't know how long it went on. Maybe minutes, maybe hours, but eventually it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the footsteps. My mind raced, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I was alone. Who would be out here? I spent the rest of the night with the lights off, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, too afraid to move. The next morning, the sun came up as usual and everything seemed fine. But I couldn't shake the sense of dread that lingered. I decided to leave early, pack up, and head back to town. Whatever had been happening was more than I could handle. As I packed my things, I heard the sound again, the crunch of boots on the ground outside. It was subtle, like someone was trying to be quiet. I froze, listening intently, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint whisper. It wasn't in any language I could understand, but it was there. I grabbed my bag, rushed out of the cabin, and didn't look back. I don't know who or what had been in the woods with me, but I never went back to that cabin. I made sure to never mention it to anyone, not because I didn't want to share the experience, but because I didn't want anyone else to go through what I had. It's been years now, and I still think about that cabin sometimes, especially when I'm out hiking. The woods can be so quiet and peaceful, but there's always that one part of my mind that wonders what's lurking just beyond the trees. I've learned to trust my instincts, to listen to that gut feeling when something doesn't feel right. And that's what saved me, leaving before I found out what else was out there. I never imagined I'd be in this situation, trapped in an old cabin in the woods, with the dark closing in around me and no one around for miles. I guess when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a remote cabin, I was just looking for some peace and quiet. I didn't expect anything to go wrong. The plan was simple enough. Get away from the city, enjoy some solitude, and relax. The cabin was small, nothing fancy. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, far from any town. I found the place online, advertised as the perfect hideaway for people who wanted to disconnect from the world. It was a charming little building with wood beams that creaked every time the wind blew. I didn't mind. In fact, I found it kind of cozy. The first day was nothing out of the ordinary. I unpacked my things, settled in, and went for a short hike through the woods. The air was crisp, the sun was shining, and it seemed like everything was going to be perfect. I'd packed some snacks, brought along a few books, and even brought my camera, hoping to take some beautiful photos of the surrounding landscape. By the evening, I had made a fire in the fireplace, the warm glow flickering off the walls. The crackling sound of the wood was comforting. I sat back in the armchair, sipping my drink and letting the quiet settle in. This was exactly what I needed. No emails, no calls, just me and the wilderness. But as the night wore on, I began to notice things that didn't seem quite right. It started with small noises, like the sound of something scratching against the walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it kept happening. A scratching sound, then a thud, followed by a pause. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the creaks and groans of an old building, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to go check outside. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The woods were dark, almost suffocatingly so. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it felt like it barely reached anything. My heart was beating faster now, and I tried to calm myself down. It was probably an animal or something harmless, I thought. I walked around the cabin, shining the light into the trees, but I saw nothing. I heard nothing either. After a few minutes of standing there, trying to shake off the unease, I headed back inside. But the minute I closed the door behind me, I heard the scratching again, louder this time. I froze. It wasn't just on the walls anymore. It was coming from the roof, like something was clawing its way across the shingles. I stood there for a long time, listening, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It was a feeling I couldn't describe. Something was out there, and it was very close. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. The air felt thicker, like it was pressing down on me. Every little noise seemed magnified, and every shadow in the corner of my eye made my pulse quicken. I knew I couldn't stay there all night, not like this. I grabbed my keys, planning to drive into town to find some help or just to get some distance from the cabin. But when I tried to start the truck, it wouldn't start. The engine sputtered but never caught. I got out and popped the hood, hoping it was just a minor issue. But when I looked inside, everything seemed fine. My hands were shaking as I closed the hood, the realization hitting me hard. I was stuck here. I tried not to panic, but that's exactly what I felt. I was alone, miles away from the nearest help, with no way to get out. The only thing I could think of was to go back into the cabin, lock the doors, and wait until morning. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop listening to the noises that seemed to come from all directions. The scratching on the roof continued, but now it was joined by other sounds. Things that seemed to shift, rustle, and even groan. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind and animals, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I thought maybe the worst was over. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the sunlight slowly fill the room. But as the day stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd go outside, sit on the porch for a while, trying to breathe and calm my nerves, but every time I turned around, I felt like I wasn't alone. The noises hadn't stopped either. They changed, though. The scratching had given way to thumping sounds, and I could feel the cabin vibrating under my feet as though something heavy was moving around beneath the floorboards. I checked every inch of the cabin, but there was nothing. No explanation. I wasn't sure what to do anymore. My phone had no signal and the truck was still dead. The only option left was to walk out of the woods and find help on foot. But the idea of walking through those trees alone, with no idea what might be lurking out there, filled me with dread. That's when I saw it. Something I hadn't noticed before. Just beyond the tree line, near a large rock, there was a structure I didn't remember seeing when I first arrived. It looked like an old shack, decaying and weathered, hidden just out of sight. I don't know why I went to investigate, but I did. Maybe I thought it would explain the strange happenings, or maybe I was just desperate for answers. When I reached the shack, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door was cracked open, and I could see what looked like old furniture and tools scattered inside. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite make out at first. It was a journal. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the pages. It was old, covered in dust, but still legible. The journal described someone who had lived in the cabin years ago, a person who had become increasingly paranoid, hearing things in the woods, seeing things in the corners of their vision. They'd written about strange noises, scratching on the walls, and things moving in the night. The final entry was the most chilling. It read, "I'm not alone here. They are watching. I hear them. I can feel them." I closed the journal and stood there for a moment, my heart racing. Everything made sense now. This wasn't just a random set of events. Whoever had lived here before me had experienced the same strange occurrences. But the real question was what was causing it. I walked back to the cabin, still unsure of what I'd discovered. The whole situation felt more real now, like I wasn't just imagining things. I felt the weight of the journal in my hand, and I knew that whatever was going on, it wasn't just in my head. Something was out there, something I couldn't explain. When I finally got back to the cabin, I locked the doors and windows and I didn't leave again. I stayed inside the entire next day, not daring to venture back into the woods. The feeling of being watched never left me, but slowly, the noises stopped. The thumping, the scratching, all of it. By the time I left the cabin, I had no intention of coming back. I was shaken, but relieved to finally make my way back to town. I still don't know what caused the strange events, but I can tell you one thing for sure. That cabin will never see me again. The only comfort I had was that I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't the first person to experience it, and I wouldn't be the last. Whatever was in those woods, whatever was scratching at the walls, was out there, waiting for the next person to cross its path. But not me. Never again. I had always been drawn to the idea of getting away from everything for a while. The thought of escaping the constant buzz of city life and finding some peace in the woods seemed like the perfect way to recharge. I wasn't a stranger to hiking or camping. In fact, I enjoyed the solitude it brought. That's why when I found this cabin tucked away in a remote part of the forest in Vermont, I thought it was the ideal place to unwind. It was early October, and the air had that crisp chill, the kind that makes you feel alive when you breathe it in. I drove up to the cabin after a few hours on winding roads, cutting through dense forest. The cabin itself was older, probably built decades ago, but it had character. Wooden walls, a porch that creaked underfoot, and large windows that looked out onto the trees. I could tell it wasn't a fancy place, but that's exactly what I was looking for. I wanted simplicity, not luxury. The owners had left a note inside explaining the basics. The cabin was functional, with a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a loft where I could sleep. As the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, I settled in. I stoked a fire, cracked open a beer, and watched the flames dance. It felt peaceful, even though the only sounds were the crackling of wood and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. It wasn't until later, when the darkness really settled in, that things began to feel off. I had made a habit of keeping the door locked when I was inside, especially at night, as the woods could get a little unnerving after dark. It was just me, alone, in a cabin far from anyone, surrounded by the thick, whispering trees. That night, however, I noticed something strange. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls, but every so often, I heard something, faint but distinct, a tapping sound, like fingers drumming on the wooden surface of the door. At first, I brushed it off as the wind, maybe a branch or an animal. But then it came again, a little louder this time, as if someone were gently knocking. My stomach tightened. I got up, slowly, and moved towards the door. I stood there, listening intently, but there was nothing. No more sounds. The wind had picked up, so maybe it was just that, but something in my gut told me otherwise. I locked the door again and went back to my seat by the fire, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. As the night wore on, I could have sworn I saw movements outside through the windows. The light from the fire flickered in odd ways, casting strange shapes that seemed to dart between the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to go to bed, hoping a good night's sleep would settle my nerves. The loft was small, just a mattress on the floor, a simple wooden frame, and an old quilt that smelled faintly of mothballs. I pulled the covers up tight, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. The cabin was silent, save for the wind howling outside and my own breathing. But every now and then, I thought I heard the floorboards creak beneath me. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but then it happened again, louder this time, as if someone were walking through the cabin below. My heart raced. I got out of bed, my feet cold on the wooden floor. I crept to the stairs, careful not to make a sound. I stood at the top, listening. Nothing. The house was still. I tried to reassure myself that I was just being paranoid. There was no one here but me. I had to be imagining things. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate creak from downstairs. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and, with a deep breath, I made my way down the stairs. My hands were trembling as I held the beam of light, sweeping it across the small living room, the kitchen, the porch outside. Nothing. The only thing that seemed out of place was a small scratch mark on the doorframe, like something had scraped against it. My thoughts were racing now. The tapping earlier, the movement outside, the creaking, none of it made sense. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, especially at night? And why was it so quiet now? Too quiet. I spent the rest of the night pacing the cabin, checking every corner, and sitting by the window, trying to see any sign of movement outside. The air grew colder as the hours passed, and I felt more and more unsettled. At around 3 a.m., I finally made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care how far I had driven to get here. The uneasy feeling was more than I could handle. But as I was gathering my things, the noises started again. This time, they were louder, and I could tell they were coming from the attic. My first instinct was to call for help, but there was no phone signal. The cabin was too far out for any kind of emergency response. With no choice but to face it, I grabbed a fire poker and headed toward the attic stairs. As I approached, I realized the door to the attic was slightly ajar. I don't know why, but something inside me pushed me forward. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the air thick with tension. I slowly opened the door and shone my flashlight into the darkness above. Nothing. The attic was empty, just a few old boxes and a strange smell in the air, like dust and old wood. But as I looked around, I noticed something odd. Footprints. Small, muddy footprints leading from one corner to the other. They weren't there when I had checked the cabin earlier. I backed away, the fire poker clutched tightly in my hands. I knew then that I wasn't alone. Someone had been in the cabin, and they had been watching me. In a state of panic, I bolted for the door. I didn't care about my stuff. I needed to get out. As I reached the porch, I saw it, the faint outline of a figure standing just outside the edge of the trees. I froze. The figure didn't move, just stood there, like it was waiting for something. I didn't stop to think. I turned and ran, sprinting through the woods, my breath ragged and my legs burning. The trees seemed to close in around me, the dark shadows of the forest disorienting me. But I didn't dare look back. Couldn't. It felt like I ran for miles, but eventually, I found a road. A truck passed by and I flagged it down. The driver gave me a strange look but stopped. I didn't care. I climbed in the back and sat there, trying to calm my racing heart. The truck took me into town and I never looked back. When I finally made it home, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened in that cabin. The sounds, the footprints, the figure in the woods. It was real, and it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. I never went back, and I'm not sure I ever will. But I learned something that night. Some places are meant to be left alone. Some cabins are better left untouched. It was the winter of 2024, just after the new year, when I decided to escape the city for a while. The hustle and bustle of work, constant messages, and never-ending noise had drained me. I needed silence, something that only the wilderness could offer. So, I rented a small cabin in the middle of nowhere, high up in the mountains of northern Vermont. The place was surrounded by thick trees and nothing but the cold, crisp air. Perfect escape. The cabin was simple, nothing extravagant, just the basics. A small living room, a rustic kitchen, a couple of bedrooms, and a fireplace. It had that old, musty smell, like it hadn't been lived in for years. But that didn't bother me. In fact, it added to the charm. I was here for peace, for quiet. The solitude was exactly what I needed. I arrived on a Thursday evening. The sun was setting as I unloaded my things from the car. The drive up had been longer than I expected, and by the time I made it, darkness had already settled in. The cabin looked isolated, far away from the nearest neighbor, and I liked it that way. No distractions, no one to bother me, just me and nature. After setting up, I started a fire in the hearth and made myself a simple dinner. The crackling of the wood in the fire was the only sound that filled the space. I remember feeling a little uneasy, though. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that I hadn't been this far away from people in a long time. But the feeling passed as I settled in for the night, wrapped up in a blanket by the fire, the warmth seeping into my bones. That first night passed without incident. The wind howled outside, the snow was falling heavily, and the temperature had dropped to well below freezing. The cabin creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, but I didn't mind. It was just the house settling, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping, a stark contrast to the harsh wind of the night before. It was still early, the sun just starting to rise. I made some coffee, bundled up in my warmest jacket, and stepped outside. The world was covered in a thick layer of snow, the trees heavy with the weight of it. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that stings your lungs but feels refreshing at the same time. I spent the morning exploring the area around the cabin. There were hiking trails, though they were covered in snow, making them hard to follow. But I didn't mind. This wasn't about hiking or adventure. It was about being alone, away from everything, and taking in the beauty of nature. I felt at peace. By afternoon, I was ready to head back to the cabin. I had been walking for hours, and the cold was starting to seep into my bones. The wind had picked up again, stronger this time, and I could hear it whistling through the trees. The sky had turned overcast, the light beginning to fade early, as it often does in the winter. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were fresh tracks in the snow leading up to the porch. At first, I thought it was just the wind, pushing snow around and leaving footprints. But as I looked closer, I realized the prints were human-sized. They didn't look like they belonged to anyone who lived around here. No one should have been out here, not in the middle of winter, not this far from civilization. My heart skipped a beat, but I shook it off. It had to be nothing. Maybe someone had come up here for a walk or had been passing through. Still, I made a mental note to lock the door that night just in case. I wasn't used to being so far from other people, and it felt odd to see evidence of someone else's presence. That night, I stayed inside, keeping the fire going and the windows covered. The wind outside howled again, louder this time, like it was trying to tear through the cabin. I heard the usual creaking and groaning of the old house, but it felt different tonight, more deliberate, as if something was trying to get in. I didn't like it, but I told myself it was just the wind. Old houses make noises. It's nothing to be scared of. But as I lay in bed, trying to sleep, I kept hearing something else. Something soft, like footsteps on the porch. At first, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The wind was playing tricks on me, I thought. But as the hours passed, I couldn't ignore it. The sound was real. Someone or something was outside, moving around the cabin. I got out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and slowly made my way to the front door. My hands were trembling, my breath coming out in quick, visible puffs. I shined the light through the frosted window, but all I could see was the thick layer of snow, nothing else. The tracks I had seen earlier were still there, but they hadn't moved. No one was outside. I checked the windows, double-checked the locks, and made sure the doors were secure. There was nothing. Still, the feeling of unease gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone here. The rest of the night passed in restless sleep, the feeling of being watched never leaving. The next morning, I woke up late, feeling exhausted. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, and the snow outside had been disturbed. More tracks, leading up to the cabin again. This time, they were closer, as if someone had been right outside my window, looking in. I spent the entire day inside, pacing the cabin, checking the locks, and making sure everything was secure. But no matter how many times I checked, the tracks remained. Whoever was out there, they weren't leaving. That night, I stayed awake, my eyes glued to the windows, my ears straining to hear any noise. The hours dragged by, and I felt every minute stretch out longer than the last. I didn't know how much longer I could take the silence, the isolation, and the constant feeling of being watched. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, I was ready. I grabbed the rifle I had brought with me, just in case, and crept to the door. The footsteps were getting closer, the crunch of snow louder with every step. My heart raced as I waited, unsure of what I was about to face. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. My heart nearly stopped. Who would be knocking at my cabin in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere? I didn't open the door. I just stood there, frozen, listening. The knocking stopped, but the footsteps continued. They circled the cabin, as if whoever was out there was trying to find a way in. The fear in my chest was palpable, but I knew I couldn't just sit here. I had to do something. I stepped outside, gun in hand, my breath coming out in visible puffs. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind howled through the trees. I scanned the area, but there was no one in sight. But the tracks were there, more of them, leading away from the cabin deeper into the woods. I don't know what made me do it, but I followed the tracks. I walked through the deep snow, the cold biting at my skin, the wind howling in my ears. The tracks led me further and further away from the cabin until I could no longer see the lights in the distance. I was completely alone in the wilderness, surrounded by the dark, heavy woods. Eventually, the tracks led to a small clearing. In the middle of it was an abandoned shack. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the roof was caving in. But the tracks led straight to it, and I knew that whoever had been outside my cabin was inside. I approached cautiously, the fear gnawing at my insides. I pushed the door open with the barrel of the rifle, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was nothing but dust and old furniture. There was no one here. I spent the next hour walking around the shack, looking for any signs of life. But there was nothing. No one had been here for years. The tracks I had been following had simply stopped. Confused and exhausted, I made my way back to the cabin, the wind still howling around me. When I returned, I locked the door, drew the curtains, and collapsed into bed. The fear was still there, but it was fading, slowly replaced by the overwhelming tiredness that came with being out in the cold for so long. The next day, I packed up my things and left. The drive back to civilization felt like a relief. The cabin, the isolation, the footsteps, they all seemed like a distant memory. Maybe it was all in my head, maybe it was the solitude getting to me, but I wasn't about to stay there to find out. I never went back to that cabin, and I never figured out who or what had been outside. But I do know one thing. When you're alone in the woods, far from anyone, you start to question what's real and what's just your mind playing tricks on you. And sometimes it's better not to know. It had been an exhausting year. Between work, personal life, and the constant rush of city living, I found myself on the brink of burnout. I needed a break, a real one. So I decided to take a solo trip away from everything to recharge. A secluded cabin deep in the woods, somewhere far from the hustle and bustle, seemed like the perfect solution. The cabin was located in the forested hills of upstate New York, about 2 hours north of Albany. I'd booked it online, in the hopes that the remote location would offer the peace I was seeking. The place was modest, tucked away on a patch of land surrounded by towering trees, with no neighbors for miles. The photos on the listing were exactly what I needed: rustic, but inviting. I left my apartment early on a Friday morning, the car packed with the essentials: food, water, a few books, and of course my phone. I figured I'd have limited service, but I was okay with that. This was supposed to be a time to disconnect. The drive out was peaceful, the roads winding through thick forests, the kind of landscape that made me feel like I was traveling into another world. The weather was perfect, a crisp autumn day with just the right amount of sunshine filtering through the leaves. When I arrived at the cabin, I felt a mix of excitement and relief. The house itself was small, a single-story structure with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch. The front door creaked when I opened it, welcoming me into a dimly lit interior. It was exactly as I had hoped. Wooden floors, simple furniture, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and windows that looked out onto the dense woods. There was a sense of tranquility here, the kind of quiet that only comes when you're truly alone. After settling in, I spent the first evening unpacking, lighting the stove, and making myself a simple meal. As night fell, I turned off all the lights and sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones. There was no one around for miles, just me and the forest. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves outside and the soft crackling of the fire. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I had spent most of the day hiking the nearby trails, taking in the fall colors and enjoying the solitude. As evening approached, I returned to the cabin, tired but content. The sun had just set, and the sky was a deep shade of purple. I made my dinner and settled into the couch with a book, the soft light from the lamp casting long shadows across the room. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like something tapping on the window. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, But it came again, louder this time. I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I felt a brief shiver crawl up my spine, but I brushed it off. It was probably just a branch or an animal. The next morning, I woke early, the air colder than it had been the day before. I got dressed quickly, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and decided to take a walk to clear my head. The woods were silent as I ventured deeper into the trees, the leaves crunching beneath my boots. After a while, I came across an old logging road, partially overgrown but still passable. I followed it for a while, the feeling of isolation sinking in further. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional bird call. I stopped for a break, sitting on a fallen log and sipping my coffee. That's when I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the mud. They were fresh, barely a day old, and they were large, far too large for any animal I knew of in these parts. The prints were human, but the odd thing was how they seemed to come from nowhere, disappearing off into the trees without any sign of a path or trail. My mind immediately began to race, wondering who else could be out here, this far off the beaten path. I quickly shook the thought away. It was probably someone from another cabin or a hunter, just passing through. But as I stood up and continued down the path, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Later that afternoon, I decided to explore the cabin's surroundings more thoroughly. I'd noticed a small stream about a quarter-mile from the cabin, and I figured it would be a nice place to relax. As I walked through the woods, the air grew denser, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. The whole place felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching me. When I reached the stream, I sat down on a large rock, letting my feet dip into the cool water. It was quiet here, peaceful even, but that feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every so often, as if expecting someone, or something, to be standing there. But the woods remained still and silent. That night, things took a more unsettling turn. I was sitting in the cabin, reading by the fire, when the tapping on the window came again. This time, it was much louder, more insistent. I set my book down and walked to the window, my heart racing. I looked out, but again, there was nothing. Just the darkness of the forest stretching out beyond the porch. I shut the curtains tightly, trying to push away the unease that had settled in my chest. But it didn't stop there. In the hours that followed, I heard the tapping again, but this time it was coming from the other side of the cabin. I stood frozen, not sure what to do. Should I go out and check? Should I ignore it and pretend I hadn't heard anything? My mind was racing, every scenario playing out in my head. Slowly, I made my way to the back door, peeking out through the blinds. The porch was empty. The woods were quiet. The next morning, I decided I would leave. Whatever had been going on here was too much for me to handle, and I didn't want to stick around to find out more. I packed up my things and started loading my car, when I noticed something odd. A small piece of paper had been wedged between the doorframe and the door. I pulled it out and it read, "Asterisk, I see you, asterisk." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The handwriting was crude, almost childlike, but the message was clear. Someone had been watching me. The panic set in then. I had to leave. Now, I got in my car and drove off, not stopping until I was miles away from the cabin. The whole drive home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone in the back seat or following me on the road. But no one ever came. I don't know who left the note or why they'd been watching me, but I learned one thing that day. Some places are better left untouched, and some things, once you uncover them, are better left alone. It was a cold evening when I arrived at the cabin. I had been looking for a place to escape the constant noise of city life for weeks, and this old cabin in the middle of nowhere seemed perfect. I had been planning this trip for months, hoping that the isolation would give me the break I needed. I wasn't looking for anything special, just some quiet time to recharge. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, about 30 miles from the nearest town, and the drive had been long and tiring. I hadn't seen another soul on the road for the last hour, which was exactly what I wanted. The forest stretched out around me, the trees standing tall and dark in the fading light, their branches heavy with the weight of winter. The air smelled fresh and crisp, a mix of pine and damp earth. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how rundown it looked. The wood was weathered, the paint peeling in several places, and the roof had a few missing shingles. But despite its neglected appearance, there was something oddly comforting about it. The windows were small and covered in grime, and the porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. I put my bag down and tried the door. It opened with a slight groan, revealing the inside. The cabin was surprisingly spacious, though it had an air of abandonment. There was a fireplace on one side of the room, a large wooden table in the center, and a couple of chairs scattered around. The floorboards creaked as I walked across the room, and I couldn't help but feel that the place had been empty for a long time. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but the firewood stacked next to the fireplace was dry and ready to burn. I set my bag down by the door, took a deep breath, and felt a sense of peace settle over me. I spent the next hour settling in, cleaning up a bit, and starting a fire in the fireplace. As the flames crackled and warmed the room, I unpacked my things and explored the cabin. There were 2 small bedrooms, a modest kitchen with an old stove, and a small bathroom at the back. It was perfect for a solo getaway. After lighting the fire, I grabbed a book from my bag and curled up in one of the chairs, ready to enjoy the silence. The first night passed without incident. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, I was warm and comfortable. I had a good dinner, read for a while, and then fell asleep to the sounds of the forest. I woke up early the next morning to the smell of pine and the faint sound of birdsong outside. I was eager to get out and explore the area, so I threw on my jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The forest was breathtaking. A thick carpet of fallen leaves covered the ground, and the trees stretched high above, their trunks straight and strong. The sky was clear, and the sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows on the ground. I decided to take a walk, following a narrow trail that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. I wandered for a couple of hours, enjoying the solitude and the quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of branches in the breeze. It felt like I was the only person in the world. But as I walked further into the woods, something started to feel off. There was an unsettling stillness to the air, like everything was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But the longer I walked, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the woods felt wrong. I had been hiking in forests like this before, but this time, there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't ignore. Eventually, I decided to turn back. The trail was winding, and the trees were thick, but I was able to retrace my steps with relative ease. When I finally made it back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. The sky had turned a deep shade of orange, and the air was getting colder. I made my way inside, eager to get warm. That evening, I sat by the fire and cooked a simple meal. The warmth of the flames was comforting, but I couldn't shake the unease I had felt during my hike. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the solitude was getting to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the night went on, I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. I locked all the doors and windows, made sure the fire was burning brightly, and curled up in my bed. The wind picked up again, howling outside the cabin, but I eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find the world outside had changed. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, and the forest was barely visible through the mist. The air was damp and cold, and there was an eerie silence hanging over everything. I decided to stay inside for the day, unwilling to venture out in the fog. I spent the morning reading and drinking coffee, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that had taken hold of me. In the afternoon, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling noise coming from the direction of the trees. I paused, straining to hear. It sounded like footsteps, but I couldn't be sure. My heart began to race as I listened intently. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the silence of the fog. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, telling myself it was just an animal or the wind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. The night that followed was the worst one yet. I could hear noises outside the cabin, soft creaks and footsteps, like someone or something was moving around the cabin. I got up several times to check the locks and make sure everything was secure. But every time I looked out the window, the fog remained thick and impenetrable. Around midnight, I heard a loud bang coming from the back of the cabin. My heart stopped. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the back door. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the beam of light as I opened the door cautiously. I scanned the area, but there was nothing there. The wind had picked up, and the trees were swaying, but everything seemed still. Just as I was about to go back inside, I heard it again, a soft, deliberate sound, like a tap against the wood. I froze, my pulse racing. Slowly, I turned around, shining the flashlight toward the corner of the cabin. That's when I saw it. A figure was standing just outside the window, its face obscured by the darkness. My blood ran cold. I backed away from the door, heart hammering in my chest. I had no idea who it was or how they had gotten so close to the cabin without me hearing them. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then backed away, my mind racing. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. My thoughts were jumbled, and panic threatened to take over. I grabbed my phone and tried calling for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. I stayed up the rest of the night, jumping at every sound, afraid that whatever was out there would come for me. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but I woke up to the sound of birds singing in the trees, the fog beginning to lift as the sun rose. When I looked outside, the figure was gone. The rest of the trip passed without any more strange occurrences, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I packed up and left the cabin earlier than planned, driving back to town with a sense of relief that I couldn't shake. I don't know who or what was out there, but I don't think I'll ever go back to that cabin again. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind me. I never found out who or what had been watching me that night, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the feeling of being completely alone, except for whatever was out there in the fog. It was late in the fall, around mid-November. I was 28 at the time, having just recently moved out to the quiet outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina, looking for a change in pace from the hustle and bustle of the city. The cabin I rented was tucked away at the end of a long, winding dirt road, far enough from any neighbors that I barely saw a soul. The nearest town was a small cluster of shops and houses, just enough to get by if you needed something basic like groceries, but not much else. The cabin itself was an old one, built from rough-hewn logs that had been stained a deep, weathered brown. It was cozy on the inside, with a stone fireplace that sat in the middle of the living room. The floor was creaky, and there was an earthy smell that I couldn't quite place, but I didn't mind. The kind of place that felt lived in, even though no one had lived there for years. It was exactly what I needed: peaceful, isolated, and quiet enough to think without distractions. The first week I spent there was perfect. I took long walks through the woods, read books by the fire, and even cooked a few meals in the tiny kitchen. It was as though time slowed down in that place. But as the days went by, I started to notice a strange feeling creeping up on me. Something about the silence. It was too complete, almost suffocating. There were the usual sounds in the forest: the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, the snap of twigs underfoot when I went on my walks. But after the sun set, the world outside seemed to fall completely still. No animals moved, no wind blew. It was as though the forest itself held its breath when night came. I couldn't explain it, but it made me uneasy. One night, a few weeks after I'd settled in, I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I heard something outside. It was faint, like a rustling sound, but it was definitely there. I set the book down and listened, straining my ears, but the sound stopped as soon as I'd noticed it. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer moving around, but something about the way the sound had stopped so abruptly bothered me. I told myself I was just being paranoid. This was a cabin in the woods, after all. Of course, I'd hear things, but as the nights wore on, the noises didn't stop. They just became more frequent. It started with the rustling sounds, but then I began to hear the occasional thud, like something heavy had been dropped near the cabin. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing, that maybe it was just branches falling or something from the roof, but it didn't feel right. One particularly cold night, the noise was louder than usual. It came from the back of the cabin, a steady thumping sound, as if someone or something was knocking against the wall from the outside. My heart began to race, my hands clammy. I got up from the couch, my breath shallow, and walked cautiously to the window. I peeked through the curtains, but there was nothing there, just the moonlight filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. But the noise didn't stop. It continued, almost rhythmic, like someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. My instinct was to call the authorities, but what would I even say? There's someone outside my cabin making noise? They'd think I was crazy. And besides, who would be out here so far from any other person? I tried to go back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the thumping, louder now, as if it was right outside my door. I finally couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and pulled on my boots. If I was going to be paranoid, I might as well check it out. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my face as soon as I opened the door. The night was unusually dark, with only the weak light from the cabin and the faint glow of the moon to guide me. I held the flashlight in front of me, its beam cutting through the darkness. The thumping had stopped. I walked toward the back of the cabin, my boots crunching on the gravel path, every step feeling like it was echoing through the quiet forest. As I got closer to the back, I paused. There was something there, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam, something that hadn't been there before. It was a large, flat stone, positioned in front of the cabin's back door. I frowned, confused. I had never seen it before. It didn't belong there. And then it hit me. This wasn't the only strange thing I'd noticed lately. The other day, when I'd gone for a walk, I had passed by the same spot in the woods. There hadn't been any stone there. I would have noticed, and now here it was completely out of place. I crouched down to inspect it, shining the flashlight across its surface. There was something carved into the stone, faint but noticeable under the dirt and moss. I couldn't make out the exact shape of it, but the markings seemed deliberate, like someone had taken the time to inscribe them. A chill ran down my spine. I should have just gone back inside, locked the door, and tried to forget about it. But my curiosity got the best of me. I reached down and touched the stone, my fingers brushing against the cold surface. As I did, I heard a sound from behind me, a snap. My head whipped around, heart pounding in my chest. The forest behind me was as dark as the night itself. No movement, no sound, just trees and shadows. But I felt it. Someone or something was out there. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. What was happening? Who had been here? I turned back to the stone and felt a sudden urge to lift it. I don't know why, but something told me that if I moved it, I might find something, answers maybe. Something that would explain all the odd occurrences since I'd arrived. I dug my fingers into the edges of the stone, using all my strength to lift it. It didn't budge at first, but after a few hard tugs, it shifted. My flashlight flickered as I pulled it free from the dirt, and the beam illuminated a small hole in the ground beneath the stone. I froze. There was something inside the hole. I kneeled down, my pulse quickening as I used the flashlight to get a better look. A small, weathered box, its corners chipped and worn with age, lay at the bottom. It looked old, like it had been buried there for years, decades, maybe. Without thinking, I reached down and pulled the box from the hole. It was surprisingly light in my hands. I set it down on the ground, brushing off the dirt and moss. The The box was simple, wooden, with rusty metal clasps on either side. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of old, yellowed papers, bound together with a fraying piece of string. I gently pulled the papers out and began to read. It didn't take long before I realized what I was holding. The papers were a series of journal entries, written by someone who had lived in the cabin long before I had. The entries were dated, going back to the 1930s. The writing was neat but frantic, as if the writer had been in a hurry, trying to get something down before time ran out. The last few entries were the most disturbing. The writer spoke of hearing strange noises at night, of feeling like they were being watched. They mentioned seeing figures in the shadows outside their cabin, watching from the trees. But the final entry stopped abruptly. The last words were, asterisk, I'm leaving. The noises are getting louder. If anyone finds this, don't stay here. It's not safe. The forest is, asterisk. The entry ended there. I shut the box with a snap, feeling a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I couldn't explain it, but everything in me told me I needed to leave. Something wasn't right. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I had uncovered something that should have been left buried. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying another night in that cabin. I grabbed my things, packed my bag, and left without looking back. It wasn't until I got to the nearest town that I started to feel like I could breathe again. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something in that forest is still waiting, watching. And maybe, just maybe, the noise I'd heard that night wasn't just in my head after. It was a cold, crisp morning in early November when I found myself driving down an old, winding road, the kind that veered off into the woods, far from civilization. My name is Greg. I'm 32 years old, and I've always been someone who enjoys being alone. After months of work piling up and the constant stress of city life, I decided to take a break. A cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect place to escape. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a small, isolated building tucked deep into the forest. My uncle had left it to me when he passed away last year. He was the kind of man who loved solitude, always retreating into the woods when things got tough. I never understood it, but now, standing at the edge of the forest, I felt the pull of silence and peace. I just needed time to reset. I parked the car in front of the cabin. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my boots as I stepped out, feeling the chill in the air. The cabin looked worn, as if it had stood there for decades, its wooden walls weathered by years of storms and snow. There was something oddly comforting about it, a sense of permanence, as though the cabin had seen countless people come and go, and still it stood. The first thing I did was unlock the door. The key was tucked into a hidden compartment under the porch, just like my uncle had told me. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and dust. It was clear no one had stayed here for a while. The furniture was simple. A few old chairs, a worn-out sofa, and a fireplace with a pile of dry logs next to it. The kitchen was small, just a stove, sink, and a table with 2 chairs. It was cozy in a way that felt almost comforting. After unpacking my things, I decided to go for a walk around the property. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The woods around the cabin were dense, with towering trees that stretched far above me. It felt like a different world out here, quiet and still. No traffic, no noise, just the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional bird call. As I walked, I found a small trail that led deeper into the woods. It was overgrown, but the path was still visible, winding its way through thick underbrush and moss-covered rocks. I followed it, curious about where it led. The farther I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. There was an eerie feeling in the air, but I shrugged it off. It was just the isolation. I was used to being alone, after all. About an hour into the hike, the trail suddenly ended at a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a large, weathered rock, half covered in moss. I could see a faint carving in the stone, something that looked like an old symbol, but I couldn't make out what it was. There was no sign of any other human presence, but the air felt heavier here. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I didn't let it get to me. This was just nature at its rawest, right? I turned back and headed for the cabin as the sky began to darken. The quietness of the woods around me felt almost oppressive, like the trees were watching me. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun had set, and the forest was shrouded in shadows. I quickly made myself dinner, a simple meal of pasta, and sat by the fire. It felt good to relax, to let go of everything I'd been holding on to. That night, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, shaking the windows and rattling the door. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the crackling of the fire. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound from the woods seemed amplified in the silence of the cabin. The floor creaked underfoot, and the wind outside seemed to push against the walls. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a loud thud. It came from outside, near the back of the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The wind had died down, and everything was unnervingly quiet. I listened intently, straining to hear any other sounds. There was nothing, just the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or a bear maybe, bumping into something. But still, a sense of unease settled over me. I lay back down, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that something wasn't quite right. But sleep wouldn't come. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness of the cabin. The next morning, I decided to go for another walk. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the forest. I needed to clear my head, get my mind off the strange feeling I'd had the night before. I grabbed a thermos of coffee, laced up my boots, and set out. This time, I decided to head towards the clearing where I'd found the rock the day before. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed denser today, the shadows longer. The trail seemed to go on forever, and I found myself growing more and more uneasy. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the trees and the rustling of the leaves in the wind. When I reached the clearing, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The rock I'd seen the day before was no longer empty. There was a pile of branches and leaves at its base, arranged in a pattern. At first, I thought it might just be a natural occurrence, something the wind had done. But as I got closer, I noticed something else. The branches were arranged too deliberately. Someone had placed them there. The symbol on the rock was clearer now, more defined. It was a circle with 3 lines extending from it like spokes on a wheel. I didn't know what it meant, but I had a bad feeling about it. I turned to leave, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong. It felt like someone was out there, watching me. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart racing. When I got inside, I locked the door and sat down, trying to shake off the feeling. But it didn't go away. The unease only grew stronger as the day went on. By evening, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to leave. I packed my things, grabbed my car keys, and headed for the door. But as I stepped outside, I froze. There, on the front porch, was a small pile of twigs and branches, arranged in the same pattern as the one at the rock. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Had someone been watching me? Were they trying to send a message? I turned and ran to the car, not looking back. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that someone was out there, lurking in the shadows of the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I found a small motel, checked in, and locked myself in the room. I sat there for hours, staring out the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I fell asleep, exhausted from the fear and the tension that had built up inside me. The next morning, I left and drove back home. I never went back to that cabin, and I haven't been back to the woods since. To this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that the cabin and the woods around it were not as empty as they seemed. Something was out there, something that didn't want me to be there. I still get the occasional thought about that place, and I wonder who or what had been watching me. Maybe I'll never know, but I've learned to trust my instincts. and my instincts told me that it wasn't a place I should ever return to. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just a break from the noise of city life. I had been working long hours at my office job, drowning in emails and deadlines. So when my friend Sarah suggested we head to a cabin in the woods, I didn't think twice. A few days of silence, fresh air, and solitude were exactly what I needed. The cabin was tucked away in the mountains, far from the hustle and bustle. It was the type of place you could only reach by winding through narrow, uneven roads, deep into a part of the forest that seemed untouched by time. I'd heard about it from Sarah before. Her family had owned it for years, but she hadn't been up there in ages. I was intrigued mostly by the idea of getting away from everything. The year was 2022, and I was 28 at the time, ready for a change of scenery. We drove for hours, crossing over hills and through valleys, until the car's tires finally crunched on the gravel driveway leading to the cabin. It was a simple structure, wooden, with a sloped roof and a small porch at the front. It looked exactly as I had imagined. Old but sturdy, a bit weathered, and surrounded by towering pines. "Here we are," Sarah said as we parked the car. She seemed strangely quiet, as if lost in her thoughts. We unloaded our bags and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of wood and something faintly musty, but in a way that felt comforting. The floors creaked beneath our feet as we explored. It had all the essentials: a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a couple of bedrooms upstairs. There was no internet, no TV, nothing that could distract us from the sounds of the forest outside. After unpacking, we decided to take a walk around the area. The air was crisp, and the trees rustled softly in the breeze. The trail leading away from the cabin seemed to disappear into the thick woods, and despite Sarah's earlier excitement, she looked uneasy. "You all right?" I asked, noticing her distant expression. She nodded quickly. "Yeah, I don't know. It's been a long time since I was here." We walked for a while, following the trail as it curved around the edge of the forest. I could tell Sarah was starting to get anxious. Her pace had slowed, and she kept glancing over her shoulder. "Something wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. I don't know," she said, fidgeting with her jacket. "It's just that sometimes this place feels off, but maybe it's just me." We continued on, but her words lingered in my mind. I tried to shake it off. After all, it was just a cabin in the woods, right? Nothing to be afraid of. As the day turned to evening, we returned to the cabin and settled in. The fireplace crackled to life as we cooked dinner, and for a while it felt like we were the only two people in the world. The isolation was peaceful, almost magical, but something about the woods outside kept pulling at the back of my mind. There was an odd stillness to the night, a quiet that felt heavier than usual. As night fell, I noticed how dark it got out there. The trees seemed to close in around the cabin, blocking out the stars. It was just too quiet. No chirping insects, no rustling animals, nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The night went on, and we stayed up reading, talking, and trying to enjoy the quiet. But it was hard to ignore that gnawing feeling of unease. Around midnight, Sarah went upstairs to sleep, and I stayed downstairs, trying to distract myself. The fire had died down, and the room was bathed in shadow, with only the faintest flickers of light from the dying embers. That's when I heard it, a faint noise, like the sound of footsteps, coming from outside. It was so quiet at first that I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, soft and deliberate, almost as if someone was walking around the cabin. I stood up, my heart racing. I had the sudden urge to look out the window, but I couldn't bring myself to move. What if someone was out there? I listened closely, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the next sound. There was nothing for a few minutes, and then it came again. This time, it was louder, and I could feel my pulse quicken. The footsteps were unmistakable, slow, measured, like they were deliberately trying to stay hidden. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the flashlight from the table, my hands shaking as I turned it on. I had to check. Maybe it was just an animal, though it seemed too deliberate, too purposeful for that. As I moved toward the door, the noise stopped. Dead silence. I stepped outside, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. The flashlight's beam swept across the yard, illuminating the trees and the ground around the cabin. Nothing. I scanned the area again, but there was no sign of movement, no tracks in the dirt. Maybe I had imagined it after all. But then I noticed something strange. There was a fresh set of footprints leading away from the cabin, heading deeper into the woods. They were big, heavy prints like someone wearing boots, and they didn't look like they had been there long. A chill ran down my spine. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to follow the tracks, but another part of me screamed to go back inside. My eyes darted back to the cabin, where Sarah was still asleep upstairs. I couldn't leave her alone out here. I decided to go back inside, locking the door behind me. I sat by the fire, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just someone passing through, someone who had gotten lost in the woods. That made sense, right? But the prints, they didn't sit right with me. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for the morning to come. When I finally did drift off, I woke up to the sound of Sarah calling my name. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" I asked, rubbing my eyes. "I saw something," Sarah said, her face pale. "I don't know what it was, but I saw someone outside." Her words confirmed my fear. Whatever I had heard the night before wasn't just my imagination. Someone had been out there. We spent the rest of the day locked inside the cabin, too scared to venture outside. We tried to keep ourselves busy, but the fear was palpable. The woods felt like they were closing in around us, and every small noise made us jump. By the time evening came, we knew we had to leave. But when we tried to drive out, the road was blocked. A tree had fallen across the narrow path leading back to the main road, and there was no way around it. We were stuck. That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, closer, and the figure, the one Sarah had seen, was standing just outside the cabin window, staring in at us. I could barely make out the shape, but it was unmistakable. Someone was watching us. Panic set in. We barricaded the doors, hearts racing. What was this person after? Why had they been following us? As the hours passed, the figure outside moved closer to the cabin, walking along the edges, occasionally stopping to peer inside. I was sure that we were being hunted. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. The figure disappeared into the night. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The next morning, we made a quick decision. We had to leave. With the tree still blocking the road, we decided to hike back to the nearest town. It was a long trek, but it was our only option. The woods felt different in the daylight, still peaceful even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept checking behind me every few steps. When we finally made it to the town, we immediately contacted the authorities. A search was launched, and the cabin was checked. They found no trace of the person who had been outside, no signs of anything unusual. But Sarah and I knew what we had seen. After that, we never returned to the cabin. The fear, the strange figure, the footsteps, it all felt like a warning. Whatever had been out there watching us had been real. We were lucky to have escaped, but neither of us ever spoke of it again. Some things, I guess, are better left unanswered.